So the moment of self-revelation was closely connected with realizing the fallibility of your parents.
Yes, one could say so.
Now, what about...
But I realized that I had fear of my mother, but not during the day. There she was quite known to me and predictable, but in the night I had fear of my mother.
And can you remember why? Can you remember what that
I
fear...
have not the slightest idea why.
Carl Jung believed that the science and rationalism of modern man had robbed him of his ability to reach for symbolic truths, but not to take everything at face value. The actual events of stories can be less important than what they represent. It should come as no surprise, then, that the Persona games approach storytelling in much the same way. They are, after all, predominantly based on Jung's model of the psyche, as we've seen time and time again in this video series. However, there are those who don't quite grasp this. They cling to their rationalism and try to find some sense of continuity and logic between these games, as if it really tells us much of anything. Granted, the games often indulge in this a little with small nods to past events, like this single reference to the Nanjo group in Persona 3. While that original trilogy of games did maintain a continuous story throughout, the modern era would more or less do away with this. From here on, continuity would become selective. The rules established in Persona 3 don't necessarily mesh with the ones established in Persona 5, and vice versa. But that's fine. We've now left the world of logic and realism and have entered the realm of symbols. They present themselves to us and reveal universal truths about the unconscious. We may strive to understand them, or be ruled by them, like an invisible hand of fate. We'll try to avoid the latter and see the bigger picture. This image may only have one meaning to you. It's the moon, the celestial body that orbits the Earth. But by the end of this video, it'll have many other associations, all of which reveal some grander truth about the story it appears in. Make no mistake, the purpose of this analysis series was never meant to be a substitute for actually playing the games. I'm disappointed by anyone that is of this mindset. No, the true purpose is to make you think symbolically, as Jung himself once espoused, and equip you with the necessary tools to get the most out of these beautifully crafted video games. You're not going to get that from any other channel or video series. So allow me to extend a hand and say, once more, welcome to the ultimate Persona Compendium. It's been several years since the original Persona trilogy came to a close, and we're now in the PS2 era, a time that could easily be considered the golden age of Atlus games. By this point, the old guard had established the Mega 10 franchise and continued to refine it artistically. But it was also a transitionary period for the developer, a bridge between the old and the new. Some of those old faces would depart the company altogether, while others would take more of a back seat to focus on other titles. The next mainline Persona entry would therefore be helmed by mostly a new team. Those that did return did so with much larger roles. Shigenori Soejima, for example, would become the main character designer and overall art director, taking up the mantle of Kazuma Kaneko. Katsura Hashino would become the new series director. He had never worked on Persona games previously, but he was the designer of Shin Megami Tensei If, which could be considered a semi-prototype of the Persona series in a lot of ways. We also have Shoji Meguro becoming the main composer after collaborating on Persona 1's soundtrack. but before actually ruining Persona 1's soundtrack.
I corrected it.
It's typically these three men that are held up as the main creative force behind Persona 3 and the modern Persona games in general, in much the same way as Kaneko, Okada and Satomi were for their games. Although, it must be said, the latter's photo shoots were significantly cooler. There's something very funny about how these game designers present themselves as rock stars. The fact that some of them would be characters in the games themselves only added to this mystique. It creates a nice personal connection between the player and the creators. This also exists in Persona 3 to a lesser extent. The appearance of Tanaka is based on the new scenario writer, Yuichiro Tanaka, who we don't really know much about. He doesn't appear in too many interviews, and when he does, he doesn't go in depth into his writing. Perhaps he prefers to let his work speak for itself. Regardless, logic dictates that he was every bit as important to the creative process as Tadashi Satomi was, but we really don't know for sure. For the purposes of this analysis then, I'll be mainly focusing on the creative input of Katsura Hashino, since he's spoken more on the game than anyone else. I don't wish to understate Tanaka's work though, so feel free to attribute some of the grander details I'm going to be discussing to him. Believe me, there's a lot to cover. Many of the series' fundamental ideas return from the first three games, so I'll only be giving them a cursory explanation here. You can click on the series playlist and watch from the beginning if you really want to be brought up to speed, but it really isn't necessary to enjoy or understand this analysis. Like the game itself, it'll be a fresh start for new fans. I'm mainly going to be focusing on just the original Persona 3 here without any of the added fluff that Atlus would later tack on. There'll be no The Answer and Persona 3 Portable material here, at least not in the first couple parts. They'll get their own analysis videos at a later date. I have, however, made one exception with the Aeon social link that was added to the game's FES re-release. It fits so nicely into the character analysis section that there really wasn't a good reason to omit it. Now, with all that said and done, let's delve into Persona 3. Persona 3 begins with an important reminder, one that will be ever relevant to the game's themes. Time never waits. It delivers all equally to the same end. You, who wish to safeguard the future, however limited it may be, you will be given 1 year. Go forth without falter, with your heart as your guide. The full weight of these words will become clear within time, but for now they act as an introduction to Persona 3's new central mechanic. From the very beginning, Persona was conceived as a more relatable take on the Shin Megami Tensei formula. Instead of a post-apocalyptic wasteland, the setting would be a regular high school, with a fairly average cast of high school students peacefully going about their lives. However, in the older games, this relatable status quo would be shattered early on, and became warped beyond recognition in the latter half of the story. While there wasn't anything wrong with this approach, it didn't do too much to separate it from the mainline Shin Megami Tensei games, nor did it take full advantage of its premise from a gameplay perspective. It was still just an old-school dungeon crawler with a different skin. Persona 3 gave us a completely new take on this idea, one that doubles down on the relatability factor. The plot would introduce the otherworldly dungeons from the get-go, but frame it within the normal day-to-day routine of a high school student. The protagonist of this game is initiated into the specialized extracurricular execution squad, which as its name suggests has him performing duties outside of his ordinary curriculum, the specifics of which we'll get into a little later with the plot synopsis. But for now, the important part is that he'll have to balance his time effectively. It's a sort of double life resembling that of a superhero. In the daytime, he'll have to study for exams and maintain relationships with his peers, while in the evening, he must fight monsters known as shadows as a Persona user. Being the player character, his name is left up to you to decide. I'll mainly be referring to him as protagonist, main character, or simply hero, while the gameplay footage on screen will show the name that the later canon would adopt. I thought I should clarify this because some people take the names in these games way too seriously. Anyway, Persona 3's protagonist differs from others in that a much greater emphasis was put on his connection to the player. It goes back to that relatability factor I mentioned. Instead of taking control of a character with a pre-established relationship with the rest of the cast, we're put in the shoes of a transfer student who is just as new to this setting as we are. Or so it would seem at first. He's also the only character you ever have direct control over. You do have party members, but they're controlled by the AI and make their own decisions based on the strategy you give them. This might sound the same as the older games, but the key difference is that the strategy you give them is merely a framework. It gives them a basic suggestion on how to act, but the action itself is left up to that party member, and it can result in some terrible or even sometimes fatal tactical blunders that a player would never make. This is perhaps the most controversial gameplay mechanic in the entire series, and it doesn't take long to find someone with a strong opinion against it. There are many rants about how Mitsuru is always casting Marin Karin or Mind Charge, how Yukari uses a single healing spell instead of a full party one, etc. I myself have many grievances with how Koromaru never seems to do anything remotely useful. He has fire, but rarely uses it on enemies that are weak against it, even when you show him exactly what to do. It's certainly a valid criticism, and one that almost every video on this game will go on at length about. But I think many tend to direct their ire in the wrong place. The problem with the battle system isn't that you can't control your party members, it's that the AI makes bad decisions. One could have existed without the other. And yet most come to the conclusion that the game should have had full party control right from the get-go. Even Atlus themselves seems to have reached this conclusion eventually, since it was a feature they added to the PSP version. It's important to understand why the original Persona 3 was made without full party control in the first place though. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate design and stylistic choice to set Persona 3 apart from other JRPGs on the market at the time. As we've discussed, a big part of it was to make us feel closer and more connected to the protagonist. But it goes deeper than that. Another radical departure this game made was to allow only one character who can switch personas at all, whereas the original allowed everyone to do it. The main character can hold multiple personas within himself and change to them as the situation demands, but your party members are limited to the ones they have. On the surface, this appears to conflict with the idea the entire series was based on. The persona was conceived as the medium between the external world and a person's psyche, one that would change to deal with different environments. The word originally referred to the mask worn by actors to indicate the role they played, and this is the function it serves for an individual in modern society. We're actors playing a part, and that part is whatever is convenient in any given moment. We might define this false self as the persona, that general idea of ourselves which we have built up from experiencing our effect upon the world around us and its effect upon us. The persona is, in Schopenhauer's words, how one appears to oneself and the world, but not what one is. Fundamentally, the persona is nothing real. It is a compromise between individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. This would mean that individuality is only an illusion, and that no individual is truly authentic. But this isn't really the case. A persona carries with it parts of the unconscious. This allows a sense of continuity between the many personas, which gives the impression of a cohesive personality. The persona is thus neither authentic nor inauthentic. It's simply one of the infinite possibilities within the psyche. This idea is portrayed faithfully with the protagonist, but not the party members. What sense does it make for someone to only have the one persona for every situation they find themselves in? It seems to be a contradiction of the concept, not to mention the continuity from the older games. Perhaps you could come up with some theory, like how only those who have entered the Velvet Room can change personas, something that can only be done by the protagonist in this game. That would be missing the point though. Remember what I said? We're now in the realm of symbols, so it's important to think about it in those terms. This is another example of Persona 3 reinterpreting ideas to convey its own unique take on the series. In real life, with enough self-scrutiny, we may be aware of the many personas we ourselves don, but we're completely in the dark when it comes to other people. This is because they only ever present to us the one persona, the one they have deemed the most acceptable for the environment.
It is completely reasonable to think that, in terms of psychological persona, the other characters had various ones for when they were shopping, hanging out with friends, and doing a multitude of other things that the hero has absolutely nothing to do with. We just couldn't bring all that into the mix because we needed some way to create a definitive separation between the hero and the other characters, from the player's point of view.
This interpretation of the concept, if anything, is more faithful to Young than even the older games. The intention is clear. Instead of being in the shoes of a main character with omnipotent knowledge of his friends' hearts and minds, we're now as we are in real life, isolated from our fellow man. It may not make much logical sense for the other characters to only have one persona, but it makes symbolic sense from the perspective of the hero, and that's the important part. Before we move on with the rest of the analysis, it's worth giving a brief overview of the game's story. If you haven't played this game for a while, this will act as a sort of refresher on the most relevant details. It should also aid those who haven't played the game at all, also known as the people who didn't listen to me at the front of this video. But that's okay. This will be the last time I pick on you, I promise. This section will skim over the character nuances for the most part. But worry not, because that will be the focus of a later part. Feel free to skip to the next section if you like. We begin the journey with our unassuming hero arriving at his new place of residence, a dormitory situated at Tatsumi Port Island in Iwatodai City. He's initially met by the mysterious apparition of a young boy at the reception desk, who asks him to sign a contract agreeing to take responsibility for his own actions. He soon meets the real residents of the dorm, a senior named Mitsuru Kirijo and fellow classmate Yukari Takiba, who introduces him to his new high school the following day.
We're here! Welcome to Gekko-kan High School! Hope you like it!
However, all is not what it appears in this seemingly peaceful island city. In truth, there's a hidden hour between one day and the next when reality is warped into a waking nightmare. This is known as the Dark Hour. For most, it passes instantaneously, but there are those who find themselves trapped there and preyed upon by shadowy monsters. These people become part of the Lost, which describes those who have been afflicted by a condition called apathy syndrome. Essentially, they become hollow shells of their former selves. There is another type of individual that experiences the Dark Hour every evening though, and these are those with the potential to manifest a persona and resist the shadows. The protagonist is one such individual, as are everyone gathered at the dorm. Mitsuru, with the help of her wealthy family, had formed a secret task force to deal with the Dark Hour and the shadows that dwell there. In particular, they must go up against the powerful ones that roam around under every full moon, for reasons that are yet unclear. In hopes of discovering the truth, they explore a mysterious giant tower that takes the place of the school during the Dark Hour, Tartarus. Initially, their numbers are quite small, but more members are enlisted as these full moon shadows are defeated. Like Mitsuru, Akihiko Sanada is a senior, and has been there since the very beginning. Junpei Iori joins right after the protagonist. Fuki Yamagishi becomes a member after the team rescues her from Tartarus. Igus is an anti-shadow robot built by the Kirijo group. who joins up after developing an obsession with the protagonist during their trip to Yakushima Island. Lastly, we have the youngest of the group, Kanamada, and the canine persona user, Koromaru. They're under the impression that once all the full moon shadows are gone, the dark hour will finally come to an end. This is what the school's chairman, Shuji Akutsuki, has been directing them to do, and it seems to be confirmed when they discover the truth of the dark hour at Yakushima Island, a truth that Mitsuru had been struggling to tell them. 10 years ago, the Kirijo group had dabbled in things they were not supposed to. They were experimenting with the shadows and discovered a terrifying prophecy that put the entire world at risk. As a result, the lead scientist, Eiichiro Takiba, Yukari's father, attempted to put a stop to the research, but in doing so caused an explosion that brought the Dark Hour and Tartarus into existence and dispersed the shadows. With his final words, he urges those who find his confession tape to seek out the shadows and vanquish them. Afterwards, the site of the experiment was rebuilt into Gekkokan High School by the Kirijo group. They would use it to further investigate Tartarus using those who had the potential to venture inside, the persona users. Natural persona users were a rare breed, however, so they went about creating artificial ones. Very few of them survived, but those that did escaped and formed the criminal group Strega, who wished to stop SEES from accomplishing their mission. They try, but are repeatedly defeated by the team as they take down the full moon shadows one by one. After destroying the last one of the Moonlight Bridge, they're confident that the Dark Hour will soon come to an end, and they can return to their mundane lives as high school students. They even celebrate the following evening, but it isn't meant to be. The Dark Hour comes like usual, and Akutsuki reveals the reason why.
The 12 shadows were parts of a whole. They were destined to be reunited. And that was accomplished in no small part, thanks to your efforts. Soon, Death, the Almighty, shall arise and bring forth the fall.
What the team were fighting for was not the eradication of the Dark Hour, but the fulfillment of the prophecy discovered by those scientists 10 years ago. The head of the Kirijo group at the time, Koetsu Kirijo, was a nihilistic man who had become captivated by the idea of the fall, an apocalyptic event that would bring about the end of humanity. Akutsuki was one of the many scientists who shared his dream, so he's been working behind the scenes to make it happen ever since. This includes the creation of the artificial persona users and even SEES themselves. He even went as far as doctoring Eiichiro Takiba's final words to manipulate his daughter. Somehow. All along, they've been unwittingly working towards the death of everyone and everything. With the truth revealed, Akutsuki now attempts to kill SEES using Agus, but she resists her programming and instead chooses to save her new friends. With this shocking revelation, the team are at a loss on what to do next. Their entire purpose has been rendered meaningless. Nevertheless, they decide to keep exploring Tartarus to prepare themselves for what's to come. Meanwhile, a new transfer student named Ryoji Mochizuki joins the school and is met with open hostility from Igus. Even as he becomes friends with everyone in class, including the protagonist, she still views him as a dangerous threat. This is because, as it turns out, he's not the unassuming new kid he and everyone else thought he was. He's actually the appriser of death, the one who acts as a harbinger of the fall and signals the arrival of the godlike being Nyx. Igus had instinctively sensed that he was the enemy of humanity that she'd fought and sealed away 10 years ago. It was a battle that took place on the Moonlight Bridge and took the lives of the hero's parents. With no alternative, Igus used the hero's body to seal away the harbinger of the fall and prevent the arrival of Nyx. This is why he appears to the protagonist every now and then in the form of a young boy named Pharos. The two form a strange sort of friendship over the course of the game. It's this bond that gave him something that he didn't have before. humanity and individuality. When he had finally matured, he sprang forth from the protagonist as Ryoji and lived as a normal teenager for a time. However, he's soon awakened to his true purpose, and is powerless to do anything about it. His time spent with the hero has made him sympathetic to humanity though, so he's willing to give them a choice to consider. If they kill him, their memories of the Dark Hour will vanish, and with it, their knowledge of the Fall. They can do nothing to stop the arrival of death, but they can choose to spend their final days in ignorance of their impending doom. Ryoji pleads with them to take his offer instead of throwing away their lives in an unwinnable battle, but they refuse. Determined to live, they decide to face Nyx on the day of its arrival. On January 31st of the following year, they head to the top of Tartarus for the final battle that will decide the fate of humanity.
I saw a TV show once where they were discussing how the topic of death has no place in our elementary education system. They visited a classroom of 4th graders and asked, who thinks someone can come back to life after dying? Half of the class raised their hands. The seriousness and finality of death seemed like such a foreign concept to them. The closer you get to high school, the greater the chance that someone you know will die unexpectedly. Still, most students only think of death as an unfortunate incident or an accident, something that is a rare and random thing. In fact, I'm pretty sure that even people in their 30s haven't given any serious thought to things like life and death.
Memento Mori, a Latin phrase meaning, remember that you are mortal, remember that you will die. These words can be found in the opening movie before the game has even begun. It's more than a little bit of flavor text though, it's our key to interpreting the entire game's symbolism from top to bottom. The inevitability of death is one of the most recurrent themes at the forefront of Persona 3. It's weaved into nearly every facet of its design in a way rarely achieved in a video game. It's very much in the same vein as those older games with how the Jungian archetypes are baked into the mechanics themselves. This is still present in the 3rd game, of course, it's still right there in the title, but now it's treated more as a foundation for the story to explore something new and bold. Anyone who has ever come across this game, even in passing, can probably tell you about its most famous bit of symbolism, even if its actual meaning is often lost on them. It is, without a doubt, the most provocative bit of imagery in its repertoire. Persona 3 gives a flashy new way for the characters to summon their personas in battle. In previous games, they just summoned them. But here they must be forced out with an evoker, a tool that purposefully mimics the appearance of a gun. It's introduced in the opening cutscene, with Yukari holding it to her head and struggling to pull the trigger. This moment serves a couple narrative functions. It's having a bit of fun with the shocking imagery to misdirect the player, but more importantly, it conveys something that is never explicitly stated. It's telling us that shooting yourself with an evoker is every bit as scary as if it were a real gun. Every time the characters summon their personas, they have to look down the barrel of a gun and be reminded of their mortality. And that, in essence, is what a persona user is for the purposes of this story. It's someone who chooses to acknowledge death instead of turning a blind eye, like those people Hashino was referring to earlier. Normal people don't know of the Dark Hour's existence. They're transmogrified into coffins and are completely unaware of anything that happens there. But the Persona users have to live through it and remember.
It's like trading away your innocence. In exchange for power, you can no longer look away from the things you don't want to see.
This is because, like the Evokers, the Dark Hour is another reminder of our mortality, a memento mori. It's something the characters must endure. It's something they choose to endure, and it's something we must endure. Death is something ever-present and inescapable. Not only are the characters forced to face this every evening, but so are we. We're told right from the beginning that we will only be given 1 year. Even before the game begins, we've been given a time limit. We're being told up front that our time on this earth is finite and we're not to forget. The clock inside of Tartarus is ticking and the calendar is marking down the days. We also find ourselves relentlessly pursued by a powerful shadow known as the Reaper if we wait around too long in Tartarus. Even if you do manage to defeat it, it will come back an infinite number of times. Any victory over death is but a temporary one. These are all fairly obvious ways in which Persona 3 reminds us of death, but as I hinted at in the opening, it also uses a much more Jungian means of conveying this central motif. It uses primordial images that have an instinctual, unconscious meaning to us, even if it isn't often clear on the surface. Before we get to Jung though, it's important to introduce a theory that was proposed by his former mentor, Sigmund Freud. He was a proponent of the pleasure principle, the theory that we're driven to pursue pleasure and avoid pain above all else. However, in the essay Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he revised this theory to account for the many contradictions he observed. After all, if the main goal of life is to seek out pleasure, why do people dwell on the past and become mired in neuroses? He speculated that life is driven by two diametrically opposing set of instincts. One is known as eros, the tendencies for life to self-preserve, build relationships with others, and propagate the species, while the other does quite the contrary. These instincts seek the shortest path to the grave. They lead individuals to self-destructive behaviors, such as risk-taking and apathy. These are the death drives, and they would later be named after Eros' opposite, Thanatos. What purpose does it serve living beings to seek out their own destruction? Why does Thanatos exist? Freud described it as an urge inherent in organic life to restore an earlier state of things. But what does this mean exactly? This is addressed, albeit indirectly, in the writings of Carl Jung, where a similar idea frequently emerges. The key difference, however, is that whereas Freud's Thanatos has its aim a literal corporeal death, the death with which Jung is concerned is not simply a biological event, but a psychological state or reality which has meaning in its own right. It's this symbolic death where our interests lie, and it's explored at length in Jung's Symbols of Transformation, which I believe Persona 3 draws heavily from. Here, he relates the unusual fantasies of a woman named Miss Miller and tries to make psychological sense of them. One of these is a hypnagogic poem about a moth flying towards the sun. The moth is Miss Miller herself, and what she longs for is the radiance of the divine, the archetypal sun hero of myth, who has been worshipped as a god in many cultures since time immemorial. Young, comely, with glowing locks and fiery crown, who, forever unattainable to mortal man, revolves around the earth, causing night to follow day, and winter summer, and death life, and who rises again in rejuvenated splendor to give light to new generations. For him, the dreamer longs with her very soul. For him, the soul moth burns her wings. Here we see that the moth to the flame spells inevitable disaster, because what it longs for is in conflict with itself. Its passion leads it to something greater than itself, but in doing so is scorched by the sun's rays. Passion raises a man not only above himself, but also above the bounds of his mortality and earthliness, and by the very act of raising him, it destroys him. This rising above himself is expressed mythologically in the building of the heaven-high Tower of Babel that brought confusion to mankind, and in the revolt of Lucifer. Even if a longing for the highest is legitimate in itself, the sinful presumption and inevitable corruption lie in the very fact that it goes beyond the fixed human boundaries. The longing of the moth is not made pure by reaching for the stars, nor does it cease to be a moth on account of such noble aspirations. Pursuing passions can either bring wholeness or destruction, and it's for this reason that we're weary about trying to live up to the Sun Hero. But to deny these passions is to stifle the very will to live itself, which robs us of our purpose. The moth may burn in the sun's rays, but death is an opportunity for renewal, and this itself is the archetypal journey of the Sun Hero, one that we must all tread. The sun rises over the horizon to its zenith and shines brilliantly in the sky. It symbolizes life, psychic energy, and impulse. In the language of tarot, it's heavily associated with happiness and satisfaction, but the sun's time in the heavens is finite. It must soon descend to the ocean and be consumed by an all-encompassing darkness. And what takes its place in the sky is an even more powerful symbol, one that you'll immediately recognize as having an important presence in Persona 3's symbology. I am, of course, talking about the moon. The moon ushers in the dark hour, the ordeal our hero must overcome if his light is to shine the following day. The sun is an abstract symbol, but it finds human form in the many sun heroes of myth. Therefore, his antagonist must also take a human shape. This is something that's directly mentioned in the game's opening, with this French text. It translates to, "Death has been personified as an anthropomorphic figure or a fictitious character since the beginning of humanity." Death dons many guises in Persona 3, but all point back to one source: death itself, Nyx. This is a figure that requires further explanation, since an antagonist named Nyx already appeared in one of the previous games. I did say that focusing on story continuity kind of misses the point, but this is an exception to the rule since it tells us quite a lot. Nyx has very little explanation in the game itself. Everything you need to know is told through dialogue, and everything else is hinted at through clever symbolism, which much of this analysis is dedicated to exploring. However, the lore itself was concretely explained in a piece of canonical supplementary material called the Persona 3 Club Book. It gives us something of a creation myth for the entire Persona series, or at least the newer Hashino-directed ones. The information here is framed as a Q&A between various Persona 3 characters, but it mainly has Aigus asking questions and Akutsuki answering them. In prehistoric times, the Earth was struck by a colossal living being of alien origin, the original form of Nyx. The impact caused a large chunk of debris to break off into orbit and become the moon. The physical body of Nyx was enclosed in the moon, whilst her psyche remained on Earth and made contact with the primitive life forms there. The psyche of Nyx existed in a sort of wave form that threatened to wipe out all living beings, so a rapid evolution took place to resist it and seal it away. This gave birth to man's greatest weapon, the collective unconscious. These are the archetypal contents of the collective unconscious, the archaic heritage of humanity, the legacy left behind by all differentiation and development and bestowed upon all men like sunlight and air. But in loving this inheritance, they love that which is common to all. They turn back to the mother of humanity, to the psyche, which was before consciousness existed, and in this way they make contact with the source and regain something of that mysterious and irresistible power which comes from the feeling of being part of the whole. Life is naturally driven to fight against its own destruction. The life drives, also known as the Eros, suppressed the deadly waves of Nyx and allowed humanity to develop into complex sapient life. But the psyche of Nyx still lays dormant in the collective unconscious, waiting for its revival. This is where the shadows come from. They're the tiny fragments of Nyx that were separated in the impact. Their main goal is to fuse together into larger shadows so that they may eventually unite into one and free the psyche from the collective unconscious, where it can finally return to its original body on the moon. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the darker and undesired aspects of the personality that have been repressed. That is to say, they've been pushed into the furthest recesses of the unconscious. This archetype makes its presence known to us in the form of symbols, and are sometimes even personified as dark, primitive creatures driven purely by instinct. This is the form they take in Persona 3, and they're encountered as the mortal enemies of the Persona users. This makes sense since they're the rejected parts of ourselves that go unassimilated into the Persona. The Dark Hour may represent death, but it's also a stand-in for the unconscious itself. It's a realm of symbols beyond the purview of those without strong self-awareness, which is why only those who have embarked on a journey of self-discovery may set foot there and do battle with its contents. It's simply another allegory for Jung's individuation process, the act of finding one's true self and fully realizing their potential. An innate urge of life is to produce an individual as complete as possible. Those without self-scrutiny don't have the necessary tools to deal with the unconscious, and are therefore vulnerable to the influence of the shadows.
No! I don't want to hear this!
They're drawn into the Dark Hour by the shadows and have a part of themselves consumed, which turns them into empty shells inflicted with apathy syndrome. The part they take should come as no surprise, since it's what they need to facilitate the return of Nyx. They take their shadows. The shadows may be antagonistic agents of Nyx, but they're also a vital aspect of the human unconscious as well. In this regard, they fulfill the same purpose as their Jungian equivalents. The shadows are our repressed, nihilistic longing for death. It calls to us from the bottom of our souls with words of comfort, promising salvation. It tells us to give in to our temptations and embrace the abyss. Should we choose to accept it and give up on life, we're left with nothing. No desire, no aspirations, no feeling, only apathy. This is spiritual and potentially even corporeal death.
What I fear most isn't death. What I fear most is attachment. Once I become attached to something, I fear that I will lose it. That's why we only live for the moment.
It isn't the shadows that are calling for death, it's humanity itself. Once again, we find that amusing contradiction at the centre of the human heart. The battle between Eros and Thanatos. We find ourselves wishing to live and to die. This delicate tightrope balance has its purpose though, as Persona 3 shows us. Without plunging into the darkest depths, the Sun Hero can never rise again in full splendour and reach his destined potential. It's only when we have something to lose that we fear death, and it's only when we fear death that we're truly alive.
I'm afraid.
We must behold death, for it teaches us how to live. This is one of the many archetypal tales passed down through the collective unconscious of humanity. They aid our heroes on their journey to triumph over death in the form of the personas. When man becomes God, his importance and power are enormously increased. That seems to have been its main purpose, to strengthen the individual against his all-too-human weakness and insecurity in personal life. This is why this game in particular draws a distinction between the personas and the enemies, the shadows. All of them come from the collective unconscious, but only one of them serves our darker impulses. With one exception. The being that was created through the unification of the shadows by the Korijo group.
They said I was death, the 13th arcana that was never meant to be. And I wasn't in this world for long before parts of my body escaped me, leaving me incomplete, as I was when I met you.
Through the protagonist, Ryoji gains the form of Thanatos, which originates from the personification of death in Greek mythology, a sort of grim reaper that carried people to the underworld, including the dungeon for the wicked, Tartarus. This being stays dormant within the protagonist for much of the game, and, like the Freudian drive of the same name, is pushing him towards death.
Go on.
To be more specific, it's pushing him towards its mother in mythology, and arguably the mother of all creation in Persona 3's universe, Nyx. Always he imagines his worst enemy in front of him, yet he carries the enemy within himself, a deadly longing for the abyss, a longing to drown in his own source, to be sucked down to the realm of the mothers. I did say earlier that I would explain the difference between the Nyx here and the one that already appeared in the first game. The one that was inhabiting the Snow Queen mask was merely an archetype of the collective unconscious, one that was meant to teach humanity how to combat the true primordial being that spurred creation. This is why the Nyx of Persona 3 has an extraterrestrial origin removed from any real-world mythology. She, or it, operates outside of everything we know, for Nyx represents the darkest depths of the night, the fear of the unknown. Let's back up a bit and return to the archetypal journey of the Sun Hero, who must eventually brave the darkness of nightfall. When the sun descends below the horizon, he finds himself consumed by an all-encompassing, endless sea. And what does the sea represent? Well, this one should be quite obvious to Persona fans, since it's mentioned in every single game.
Thou art I, and I am thou. From the sea of thy soul I cometh.
The sea, and water in general, points back to the collective unconscious as a maternal symbol of humanity. It is the life-giver, the protector, and the nourisher, just like a mother to her newly born baby. It is an absolute authority figure, which is why it manifests as all-encompassing symbols such as the ocean, cities, darkness, and even the moon. It also takes on a human guise as the many maternal goddesses seen throughout mythology. This is the Great Mother archetype in its purest form, as the birth giver of human intuition and creativity. However, the duality inherent to the archetypes dictates that every positive force must also have a negative, a shadow self if you will. The antithesis of the Great Mother is the Terrible Mother, which is symbolically synonymous with death. This mother then is not only the mother of all abominations, but the receptacle of all that is wicked and unclean. The birds are soul images, by which are meant the souls of the damned and evil spirits. Thus, the mother becomes the underworld, the city of the damned. The underworld in Persona 3 is the Dark Hour, specifically Tartarus, which makes it symbolic of the terrible mother, death, and the unconscious all rolled into one. This makes it appropriate as the central gathering place of the shadows, and the main dungeon that the player explores for much of the game. The tower facilitates the arrival of Nyx, and its height represents humanity's collective desire for death. Its phallic appearance reaches out to the moon, which according to Jung represents the uterus. This makes the moon a very feminine symbol indeed, something that we previously learned in the Persona 2 analysis with Maya Amano. It's worth noting that the sun is a masculine symbol. So what we have here is the sun trying to make his way back into the mother's body. For whoever sunders himself from the mother longs to get back to the mother. This longing can easily turn into a consuming passion which threatens all that has been won. The mother then appears on the one hand as the supreme goal, and on the other as the most frightful danger. The terrible mother. Needless to say, this requires further explanation, but I'm afraid I'll have to leave it for a later section of this video. For now, the important part is that humanity, represented by the Sun Hero and embodied by the protagonist, strives to return to his origin, the mother. This is a necessary step on his journey if he is ever to reach his destination.
(7月13日午前0時影時間始まる) Persona 3 Atlas.
No one can escape time. It delivers us all to the same end. You can't plug your ears and cover your eyes. And so it begins.
The journey of the protagonist is our journey, shaped by our decisions. This is the meaning of the contract that Pharos has assigned at the beginning of the game. In signing it, we're choosing to face death and see the journey to its conclusion. But what is that journey, exactly? It's all revealed in a deck of tarot cards. Or as Nyx would say, the Arcana is the means by which all is revealed. The tarot cards tell a story in numerical order, representing the spiritual growth and transformation of an individual as he embarks on a journey of self-discovery. The P3 hero finds himself in the role of this individual, as he holds the power of the Fool, the first card in the Major Arcana, bearing the number 0. The illustration on this card depicts a foolish wanderer. His innocence and naivety of the world suggests unlimited possibilities. As he moves through the Major Arcana, he encounters archetypal figures representing the different stages of life. He must incorporate these experiences into himself if he is ever to realise his full potential. These appear as the social links, the bonds with other people the hero must forge to strengthen his personas. Each one of these is a learning experience, a chance for the Fool to catch a glimpse of the many universal truths passed down by the collective unconscious. Like the personas themselves, these archetypes are the weapons the hero must arm himself with to combat the trials that await him. But as we discussed earlier, there's always a duality to the archetypes, and this also holds true for the tarot cards as well.
Be careful, this Hierophant is quite powerful!
The shadows also bear the Arcana, making them necessary obstacles on the Fool's journey. The RPG genre is uniquely suited for this kind of symbolism, since every defeated enemy gives the characters experience points to level up. Each new full moon shadow is stronger than the last, requiring the hero to get progressively stronger to survive. Each new experience is an opportunity for growth and to strengthen one's heart. The Arcana of the Shadows stands in opposition to that of the social links. One represents the card in its positive, upright position, and the other in its reversed, negative position. The game only requires that the hero defeats the latter, since most of the social links are entirely optional. I'll be giving a full analysis of each of them in a later video, so for the time being, we'll only be focusing on the more story-relevant full moon shadows. It's also worth mentioning that Persona 3 has its own tarot deck. This is heavily based on the Rider deck though, so we'll be using both for reference when analysing each arcana. First, the Fool faces the Magician, his entry into the world of the occult and mysticism. There's nothing too much to say about this one. It shows up and gets instantly obliterated by Thanatos. Next, the party comes across the High Priestess as it hijacks a train. The card depicts a woman with divine knowledge sitting between two pillars, one white and one black. This is symbolic of the duality in all things. The Persona 3 version of the card simplifies this illustration quite a bit, but the same yin and yang motif is still present. The priestess asks the Fool if he has the intuition to tell the light from the dark, the real from the fake. Next we have the first double boss fight, featuring the two regal arcana, the Emperor and the Empress. Much of what I've said, and will continue to say about the Terrible Mother, is relevant to the Empress. The Queen of Life, in its reversed position, becomes the Queen of Death, the Destroyer. It's from this figure that we come to understand the meaning of life and death. The Emperor is the masculine equivalent, representing the Great Father in its upright position and the wrathful abuse of his authority in the reversed. After that, we come to the masculine counterpart to the High Priestess, the Hierophant. Upright, it points to conformity to traditional wisdom and teachings. particularly in regards to Orthodox religion, as the Pope-like figure alludes to. Reversed, this card can take on a myriad of different meanings, but in the context of this game, it seems to point to the hypocrisy and corruption of the pious leader. He has succumbed to the deadly sins of gluttony and lust, represented respectively by his obesity and throne held up by sexualized women's legs. Not to mention, this figure is encountered in the most inappropriate of places, a seedy love hotel. This brings us to the Lover's Arcana, a card that depicts the prospect of harmonious love between man and woman. This is a perfect union between the opposites. In the Rider deck, it also alludes to the fall of man through Adam and Eve, which warns of succumbing to temptations and losing connection to the divine. While the Hierophant is about following the order of society, the Lover's is about personal choice and responsibility. The importance of this choice is emphasized by the gulf or divide between the two figures. Reversed, the harmony is disturbed, and the union begins to show its cracks. It becomes about the lack of choice, which is what happens when the hero and Yukari are almost forced to give in to their temptations. The Lover's shadow is a goopy, melting heart, symbolizing love built on unsolid foundations. Next, Cease heads to the disused bomb shelter underneath Iwatodai to fight the next pair of Arcana, the Chariot and Justice, both of which join together to form a World War II era battle tank. The Chariot card illustrates an armoured conqueror standing on a chariot pulled by two sphinxes, one white and the other black, just like the High Priestess. The conqueror is able to make the two opposing sphinxes move in the same direction, representing his triumph over mind and spirit. When reversed, this control falls into disarray, and the conqueror becomes a conqueror in name only. His victory becomes defeat, which is why he's found not on the battlefield, but inside of a dingy old bomb shelter. Nevertheless, he holds on to his tyrannic justice and wields it as his main weapon, which is why it's the tank's cannon. Only when both the Conqueror and his justice are defeated is this battle won. The next month, the team fights a hermit at Club Escapade in Polonia Mall. It takes up residence there and connects itself to the city's electricity grid to use as a source of power. The Hermit card stands for introspection, and is illustrated with the lamp of Hermes Trismegistus, representing higher knowledge. Reversed, it takes on the meaning of becoming too withdrawn from the world in pursuit of inner knowledge. In the Shadow's case, this refers to how it focuses solely on draining energy for itself at the expense of others. Next, we have another dual boss fight, this time against Fortune and Strength. Strength is illustrated as a woman with flowers who has tamed a ferocious lion. The lion represents the wild, uncontrolled passions of the unconscious, and in taming it, the woman has achieved unity and strength within the self. Interestingly, Fortune, which mainly represents fate, seems to have taken on the role of the lion in this pairing. Reverse Strength implies that the raw passions of the lion are running rampant and are no longer under her control. Indeed, in this boss fight you must defeat Strength before Fortune becomes vulnerable. Now we get to the final full moon shadow, the Hanged Man, which hovers menacingly over the Moonlight Bridge, an omen of what's to come. The card depicts an entranced man hanging upside down on gallows. It's from this necessary sacrifice that he gains new insight and a different perspective on the world. And yet, in this position, he's stuck and is unable to take action, which can lead to spiritual stagnation. This is represented in the boss fight with how the Hanged Man must be forcibly removed from his position. The sun is behind the Hanged Man's head and is almost at its lowest point. It approaches the darkness of night, where the Queen of Creation awaits the final duel. What follows is some extremely striking imagery and symbolism. From the moon descends the Nyx avatar, the harbinger of the fall, and the fusion of Ryoji and Nyx. Standing defiantly before it are the members of SEES, determined to live and see tomorrow. It is the final challenge of the Sun Hero if he is ever to rise again the next morning. This is a very long and arduous fight that has many phases, all of which are represented by different arcana. It starts with a mirror being held up to the protagonist with the Fool. This is in reference to how Ryoji and the hero were once one and the same. From here, Nyx will go through the previously fought arcana before arriving at its 13th and final form.
The moment man devoured the food of knowledge, he sealed his fate. Entrusting his future to the cards, man clings to a dim hope. Yet the arcana is the means by which all is revealed. Beyond the beaten path lies the absolute end. It matters not who you are. Death awaits you.
It would appear that the Fool's journey comes to an end at the hands of the terrible mother, Death, which, as Nyx just said, is the fate of all humans after the biblical fall of man. But this isn't the whole truth. The Death Arcana is, at first glance, a terrifying omen of the end, and yet its place in the middle of the tarot deck seems to suggest otherwise. It actually tells of a spiritual death, rather than a corporeal one. It's a necessary process that brings with it an opportunity for renewal, just as the sun will always rise once more after sinking into darkness. Ascent and descent are actually two sides of the same coin. The Fool may descend into the unconscious to face himself, but he does so by ascending to a new state of being. His ascent signifies a renewal of the light and hence a rebirth of consciousness from the darkness, i.e. from regression to the unconscious. The protagonist climbing the tower to meet death and the rising elevator of the Velvet Room are both symbolic of this. All living things rise like the sun from water and sink into it again at evening. Born of springs, rivers, lakes and seas, man at death comes to the waters of the Styx, and there embarks on the night sea journey. Those black waters of death are the water of life. For death, with its cold embrace, is the maternal womb. Just as the sea devours the sun, but brings it forth again. Life knows no death. The terrible mother is the reason for the Sun Hero's deeds. He does everything to return to nothing, to the comfort of the mother's womb, so that he may be born anew. Ironically, he seeks death so that he may live once more. Of course, the son entering into his own mother would be a form of incest, which is why the symbol appears as a terrifying creature representing death. It's a taboo man must never break, lest he regress to his animalistic desires and become truly lost. Regardless, the hero must return to the mother so that he may break away from her and reclaim his unconscious contents. To sum things up for simplicity's sake, this journey is merely an allegory for Jung's individuation process, as many things are. The sun represents the conscious, and the mother the unconscious, which is the origin of all things. The sun delves into the unconscious to discover his true self and rise once more as a unified whole, a new person. This image is undoubtedly a primordial one, and there was profound justification for it becoming a symbolical expression of human fate. In the morning of life, the son tears himself loose from the mother, from the domestic hearth, to rise through battle to his destined heights. His life is a constant struggle against extinction, a violent yet fleeting deliverance from ever-lurking night. This death is no external enemy, it is his own inner longing for the stillness and profound peace of all-knowing non-existence, for all-seeing sleep in the ocean of coming to be and passing away. Even in his highest strivings for harmony and balance, for the profundities of philosophy and the raptures of the artist, he seeks death, immobility, satiety, rest. If he tarries too long in this abode of rest and peace, he is overcome by apathy, and the poison of the serpent paralyzes him for all time. If he is to live, he must fight and sacrifice his longing for the past in order to rise to his own heights. If the hero does not face himself, doesn't face his longing for death. He can never find rebirth through the individuation process and will inevitably come to spiritual stagnation. He must slay the beast known as the Terrible Mother and separate himself from her sweet embrace of death. This is an archetypal story as old as time, and in the modern context, this can be understood as a coming-of-age tale, of growing up and becoming your own independent person. Indeed, this is the exact type of story that Persona 3 is. It is, after all, primarily about the trials and tribulations of juveniles as they come to understand themselves and their place in the world. The natural course of life demands that the young person should sacrifice his childhood and his childish dependence on the physical parents, lest he remain caught body and soul in the bonds of unconscious incest. This imagery of sacrifice is a recurring one in this tale as well. This is the final piece of symbolism to decode before we get to the story's ultimate conclusion. The Persona series is no stranger to Christ allusions at this point. It was a big focus during my Persona 2 analysis, and it makes a return here. Like Maya Amano before him, the Persona 3 hero finds himself symbolically in place of Christ. The significance of this cannot be ignored, for it harkens back to the most important theme in the Persona series, the idea of striving for the self through individuation. In the distant past, an individual's worth was measured by his role within the family, and then later his role as a citizen. But this started to change after the 1st century with the rise of Christianity. Christ offered an alternative to a world that saw people not as individuals but as members of a group. Because only by using their free will to submit themselves to Christ, becoming one with His Holy Spirit, can they find salvation. This salvation was not offered to them as a representative of their family or government, but as an individual. First, Jesus crucified, then Jesus resurrected. Previously in antiquity, it was the patriarchal family that had been the agency of immortality. Now, through the story of Jesus, individual moral agency was raised up as providing a unique window into the nature of things, into the experience of grace rather than necessity, a glimpse of something transcending death. The individual replaced the family as the focus of immortality. As contradictory as it sounds, by offering themselves fully to the Lord, they've been granted everlasting freedom. They have regained that which was lost after the fall of man. Thus, individuality, the foundations of individuation, came into being, and man could achieve rebirth through faith. This is represented by the practice of baptism through water, which, as we've established, is symbolic of the mother's womb. In Christianity, for example, baptism represents a rebirth, as we have already seen. Man is not merely born in the commonplace sense, but is born again in a mysterious manner, and so partakes of divinity. Anyone who is reborn in this way becomes a hero, a semi-divine being. Thus, Christ's redemptive death on the cross was understood as a baptism, that is to say, as rebirth through the second mother, symbolized by the tree of death. Jung explains earlier the maternal symbolism behind the cross. In this world of images, the cross is a tree of life and at the same time a tree of death, a coffin. Just as the myths tell us that human beings were descended from trees, so there were burial customs in which people were buried in hollow tree trunks, whence the German Totenbaum, tree of death for coffin, which is still in use today. The Christ archetype offers up his life on the cross to subjugate his instincts and become one with the mother. He emerges as a transcendent figure associated with the sun, just like our sun hero archetype. Therefore, the Christ archetype is symbolic of the Jungian individuation process, the act of reaching the self and becoming a unified whole. Christ, as a hero and God-man, signifies psychologically the self, That is, he represents the projection of this most important and most central of archetypes. The archetype of the self has, functionally, the significance of a ruler of the inner world, i.e., of the collective unconscious. This should shed light on Persona 3's use of Christ and crucifixion for its symbolism. Let's go through them, shall we? Akutsuki intends to kill Seas after they unified the shadows during November. He does this by putting them on crosses to sacrifice to the terrible mother, Nyx. Because the Dark Hour is so prominent in this scene, it must represent the negative aspect of the Christ crucifixion imago. It becomes the Tree of Death instead of the Tree of Life, which would stand for spiritual stagnation and a literal corporeal death, as opposed to a rebirth. The same can be said about Takaya, the leader of Strega, who strongly resembles famous depictions of Christ. He's a charismatic leader who preaches salvation, yet the salvation he speaks of is only to give in to nihilistic longings for death. He claims to speak the truth, yet only deals in short-sighted deceptions, like a false prophet. He stands in opposition to the protagonist as an antichrist figure. He's a death drive incarnate. It's fitting then that his persona is another child of Nyx from Greek mythology, Hypnos, the god of sleep. He's lulling his followers into a state of apathetic sleep, where they're susceptible to the death drive. Chidori, in particular, ends up becoming a victim of this. Instead of life, he strives for death. Instead of enlightenment, he teaches ignorance and apathy. Conformity instead of individuality. He's a mirror, a dark reflection of what the fool could become if he simply wallows in spiritual stagnation. He is the shadow of the Christ archetype, the dark half of the human totality, which is to say, he is the shadow of the self. He's a type of regressive figure that Jung was talking about in this quote from earlier. Both he and Jin act as the final obstacles before the party can face Nyx on January 31st. They die here, but they already died long ago, as prisoners of their own unconscious yearning for death. Finally, we have the protagonist, who is the most important expression of the Christ archetype in the entire game. His initial persona is Orpheus, the figure of Greek myth who descended into the underworld to save his wife, Eurydice. He used his mastery of the lyre to charm the ferryman Charon into carrying him across the river Styx, where he would plead with the god of the underworld, Hades, into letting her go. Hades agreed, on one condition. Orpheus is not to look back at his wife on their return from the underworld. He does so, but makes the mistake of looking back when he thought they were both clear of Hades' domain. Eurydice sadly wasn't, and she vanishes, lost forever to the abyss. Using our knowledge of Jungian symbolism, parts of this story take on a whole new light. The underworld is, of course, the unconscious, and Orpheus being able to navigate its depths through his skill shows us that he has a good grasp of himself. This makes him the perfect figure to represent the hero as someone who can explore Tartarus, and even challenge death itself. But what of Eurydice? She could be symbolic of many different things, but in our interpretation, she would be another part of Orpheus himself, possibly his anima. By turning back before the two are unified, turning his back on individuation, he loses a part of himself to the unconscious. This would make it a cautionary tale about the hero leaving his journey unfinished. Something that can actually happen if the player chooses to kill Ryoji instead of letting him live. Killing death in this context is essentially turning your back and choosing to ignore it. The correct path would therefore be letting it live and incorporating it into the ego, which is what the members of SEES do by never forgetting it and facing it time and time again. But this is just the first necessary step on the individuation process. Death still appears as a terrifying figure rather than a hopeful symbol of rebirth. Thus death is a fundamentally ambivalent image. the implications of which depend on whether it is approached from the reality of the ego or from that of the self. For the former, death is indeed a fearful piece of brutality, but from the perspective of the self, death appears as a joyful event, a mysterium canutius through which the soul achieves wholeness. It seems in the good ending, the hero takes the tragedy of Orpheus to heart, as he's able to fuse him with Thanatos to create the perfect union of the opposites. This is Messiah, the ultimate persona of the Judgment Arcana and of the hero himself. He takes on the appearance of both Orpheus and Thanatos combined, and resembles a Christ-like figure on a cross. Messiah is not Christ himself though, merely the archetype. The sacrificial death of the ego in service of reaching the wholeness of the self. This is man's greatest endeavour, his telos. This finally brings us to the end of the game, where the hero's story would find a very similar resolution. After defeating the final form of the Nyx avatar, the party finds that all of their effort was for naught. The body of Nyx descends from the moon to reunite with its psyche and bring about the end of all life on Earth.
Why resist that which is inevitable? You'll only suffer.
All seems lost, but the protagonist recalls the unbreakable bonds of his social links. Each one taught him something new and important on his journey, and in turn he did the same. He left them with proof that he existed. Each interaction became his power and strengthened his resolve to cling to life and see his journey to its completion, which is where he now finds himself. He has arrived at the World Arcana, the end of the Fool's journey. It represents the end and the beginning of a new cycle. The card is illustrated with a woman in the centre of 4 figures that correspond to the 4 evangelists, something we looked at quite thoroughly back in the Innocent Sin video. This is a reoccurring arrangement that Jung called the quaternity, and typically the centre is occupied by the sun and the image of Christ. This represents Christ as being at the centre of all things, and since Christ is symbolic of the self, it means that the Fool has integrated the opposites and become a unified whole. This is the ultimate symbol of accomplishment, and with it, the hero may now do the impossible and conquer even death itself. He ascends to the moon, the symbol of the terrible mother, and enters into the womb to face her true form, an egg-like shape with ghostly arms reaching out, promising safety in the sweet embrace of death. At the core of the egg is the glowing light of creation, yet it uses a single attack simply named Death. Like the World Arcana, it is both the beginning and the end, life and death. It represents the unlimited potential of the human unconscious in all its faculties, its destruction as well as its rebirth. Thanks to the strength of his bonds, the hero unlocks his final ability, Great Seal, which can seal away Nyx and bring about a new beginning. Thus, the journey of the Fool comes to an end. The hero has found freedom through rebirth and become an enlightened figure, similar to Jung's wise old man archetype.
He's found the answer to life's greatest question. It just happened a bit sooner than it will for the rest of you.
A quaternity appears on the Tower of Tartarus resembling a cross, and it vanishes along with the Dark Hour, never to manifest ever again. Unified man has triumphed over the dark half of the human totality. This is humanity's final answer to Nyx. In the first part of this Persona 3 analysis, we mainly discuss the story and symbolism. In this part, we're going to be doing much of the same, only this time focusing on the game's expansive cast of characters, specifically the many bonds the hero forms over the course of his journey. They all have their own contained stories that I've only briefly touched on. I'll be going through them individually here, starting with the members of FES that join your party throughout the game.
I know how tough it is being the new kid, so wanted to say, hey, see what a nice guy I am?
Junpei Iori is a classmate of Yukari and the protagonist. He's an easygoing guy who is cheerful, goofy, and incredibly friendly, almost overbearingly so if Yukari is to be believed. He's among the first students to welcome the hero to the school, but it isn't long until he discovers that he's a Persona user as well, and becomes a member of FES thereafter. His reasons for joining are somewhat questionable though. For the rest of FES, being a hero from the shadows is enough, but Junpei wants to be perceived as one by others. He wants to be a cool superhero who is popular with the girls, so he's quick to charge in recklessly to prove himself. Early on, he believes that he should be the one in charge, and develops an inferiority complex towards the hero as a result. He believes that fighting shadows during the Dark Hour is the only thing he's ever been good at, and sees it as a preferable alternative to having to study for school and think about the future. He laments that, if the Dark Hour were to go away, he'd be completely worthless. It's when he feels most alive. He admits that he doesn't truly know what he's fighting for. It's only after he meets Chidori that this begins to change. Even after it turns out she was just using him to stop FES from ending the Dark Hour, he still rushes to her side in the hospital. He's able to throw aside his selfishness for the sake of someone he cares about. He becomes the cure to her nihilism, and in turn, she becomes his new reason for fighting. Chidori's persona is Medea, a sorceress from Greek mythology who falls in love with the hero Jason, a descendant of the Olympian trickster Hermes, who, as fate would have it, is Junpei's persona. This makes it the only persona among the Strega members that is not a child of Nyx. On the contrary, her persona is able to emit life at the cost of her own. She wishes to die, yet she doesn't want to return to nothing like Takaya and Jin. She wishes to leave a part of herself behind to give strength to those she loves. This is what she does when Junpei is fatally shot by Takaya. She sacrifices her own life to resurrect him, and in doing so, forever leaves a part of herself within him. This is the Spring of Life ability that becomes a part of his ultimate persona, Hermes Trismegistus, the combination of Hermes and the Egyptian god of knowledge, Thoth. He authored the philosophical teachings of the Hermetic texts, such as the famous phrase "as above, so below," which is illustrated on many versions of the Magician Tarot card. Regardless, it's clear that this version of Hermes is also meant to be in the position of the hero Jason from the Argonautica, who set sail on a quest with important figures such as Orpheus and the Dioscuri, which will come up again later. This might be a little too heroic for a character such as Junpei. In fact, this was originally going to be the hero's persona, according to Soejima, but it certainly suits his growth from a wannabe hero at the beginning of the story to a real one.
We should fight.
I agree.
Fuki Yamagishi is someone who is first heard about rather than met. She's a quiet and reserved honor student, and this made her the target of bullying by some of her peers. She was locked inside of the gym one evening and seemingly vanished into thin air. In actuality, she had become lost in Tartarus, and this is where she would remain for the next 10 days, or rather 10 hours for her, until being rescued by FES. She had managed to avoid shadows in this time by using the latent powers of her persona, Lucia, which would only fully awaken when she decides to protect the very girl who had locked her in there in the first place, Natsuki. The way Lucia is summoned is rife with symbolism. Instead of appearing on the front lines, it envelops Fuka and everyone around inside of what can only be described as a womb. This is representative of how it's only able to protect and provide support for others. Saint Lucia was the patron saint of the blind, a Christian martyr during the Great Persecution who provided food and aid to the poor. This not only makes her an appropriate figure to guide us through the darkness of Tartarus, but it also informs us a lot about Fuka herself. She has the kindness and compassion of a saint, which is how she's able to forgive Natsuki and accept her as a friend. But before, she was passive. She was just trying to please the people around her, whether it be her parents or school bullies, and her heart was closed off. Her awakening is Fuka finally asserting her will to live, and it comes in the form of a desire to connect with others and help them. This is why much of her social link is based around her trying to become a better cook. This could be seen as the true power of her persona, to connect to others even when far away, and because of this, she no longer fears drifting apart from her friends. She's found a sense of comfort with her bonds. It's this realization that awakens her ultimate persona, Juno, the Roman goddess of marriage. Marriage would be the most developed and mature bond one could form. I'm sure with everything we discussed in the first part, I don't need to explain the significance of the mother's womb. In short, both personas embody the positive traits of the Great Mother, which is the archetype featured on the Priestess card.
You see, I had overestimated my ability to handle everything alone. Few people can be that strong. There are times when we cannot stand without the support of others.
Mitsuru Kirijo is the fearless commander of SEES who fights to atone for her family's sins. It's a responsibility that's weighed on her since she was a child and has forced her to mature quicker than most, shaping her into the intelligent and level-headed leader she is today. Whatever the situation, she's always the one in control. This aspect of her personality is reflected in the slight dominatrix motifs in both her design and the design of her personas. She never allows herself to be emotionally vulnerable, instead preferring to be objective and detached from the people around her. Even when it comes to herself, she must maintain control at all times. This is one of her greatest assets, but it's also her biggest weakness, and doesn't follow the Kirijo family creed. 2 in harmony surpasses 1 in perfection. By closing herself off, she's unwittingly created a number of blind spots in her personality, the biggest of which is one I mentioned earlier, her reason for fighting in the first place. She doesn't fight for some lofty goal like atoning for her family's evil. She fights simply to make her father happy. It only makes sense then that when he dies, she will be left with nothing.
Our days of fighting together are over. We have no common goal to fight for, no enemies to defeat, no reason to be friends.
Her will to fight is completely shattered. That is, until she realizes that she's not alone. Yukari feels the same pain. Finally, she's able to open up to another person, and awakens to her ultimate persona, Artemisia. Both of her personas are strong female warriors that were also monarchs, befitting the Empress Arcana. This is the role Mitsuru plays in SEES. She's able to provide support like Fuka, but she's also able to join the fray. She primarily uses ice magic, which could reflect how she's a little cold and unapproachable. In fact, she won't even hang out with the protagonist until he's of genius-level intellect. However, her social link reveals a more naive and vulnerable side due to her sheltered upbringing. She's torn between an arranged marriage for the sake of the Kirijo group and pursuing her own happiness. She even considers running away from everything entirely, but ultimately finds strength to do both thanks to her budding romance with the protagonist. Once again, Mitsuru finds strength through her bonds with other people. With this, she's able to face the future with renewed purpose and determination.
I know what it's like to feel powerless, and I don't want to feel that way again.
Akihiko Sanada is the cool, reliable senior of the group, the emperor to Mitsuru's empress, or at least that's what he would like you to believe. The truth is, he can be quite socially awkward and is prone to overcompensating. He's not above participating in the other guys' silly hijinks. He has a strong determination to be the best, whether it be in combat or more trivial matters, such as picking up women at the beach. This drive stems from a very serious place though. He grew up in an orphanage with his little sister, Miki, who tragically perished in a fire when he was 9 years old. Even though there's nothing he could have done to prevent this, he still holds himself to blame. If only he was stronger. If only he wasn't powerless. He could have saved her. In his mind, eliminating his weakness was the only way to atone, so he swore to become strong enough to protect the people close to him. This led to the awakening of his persona, Polydeuces, a demigod warrior from Greek mythology who was a master in hand-to-hand combat, reflecting how Akihiko's fighting style of choice is boxing. Another important bit of symbolism in this persona is how the head is much smaller than the overdeveloped body. According to Soejima, this reflects the immaturity of Akihiko's worldview. It ensures that his sister's death will forever fester inside of him, coming to the surface during every moment of weakness. It's a strong motivator perhaps, but it's undoubtedly caused him a great deal of anguish. This is a serious character flaw that he shares with his childhood friend, who we must discuss before continuing.
This is how it should be.
Shinjiro Aragaki is first introduced as a mysterious acquaintance of Akihiko. He later shows up in a rough part of town and saves our heroes from a scary encounter with a gang. His thuggish appearance and icy cold glare seem to fit the surroundings, but his actions tell a different story. He's actually a former member of FES who grew up in the same orphanage as Akihiko. He was also deeply affected by the death of Miki and swore to become stronger for the sake of his friend. He awakened to his persona, Castor, the mortal twin brother of Polydeuces. Together, they were known as Dioscuri, and they fought side by side in the Greek epics, such as the aforementioned Argonautica. From this alone, we can gather that these two persona users were extremely close allies in battle. However, a terrible accident would soon drive them apart. While hunting for shadows, Shinjiro's persona went berserk and killed an innocent bystander, the mother of Kenamada. He was fighting to protect people, and now he was directly responsible for someone's death. Guilt-ridden, he left FES and sought atonement in his own way. He started using persona-suppressing drugs in an attempt to escape his past and get rid of his persona entirely. This aspect of the story is a little hazy since his persona never goes berserk again, and neither does any other naturally awakened persona. It could mean that he lost control in battle and this allowed his persona to run rampant. In any case, he no longer saw his persona as a means of helping people. It could only cause death and destruction. And perhaps, by extension, he came to the conclusion that that was all he was capable of as well. Although he refused to admit it, the drugs would eventually kill him. He was subconsciously seeking the grave, driven by the death drive. And he was okay with that. It was his way of atonement after all. Or at least it would have been, if Kenamada didn't join FES as a persona user. This revelation prompts him to return to FES himself, knowing full well what would await him if he did. The Dark Hour represents death. For those who wield a persona, it's inescapable. They must face it every evening at the stroke of midnight. For Shinjiro, this reminder of death, this reminder of his own mortality, took on a different meaning. It no longer represented the future, his own eventual death, but the past. Just as he cannot escape the future, he cannot change the past. And this is why Shinjiro shirked his duties as a persona user and tried to run away. It's only appropriate then that his death would come when the past, Kenamada, and the future, the Dark Hour, would converge.
It's my fault. This is what I deserve. But let me give you one warning.
Warning?
If you decide to take my life, you'll end up like me. Just remember that.
Akihiko's obsession with becoming strong stemmed from his desire to protect the ones he loved. And yet, he was utterly powerless to save Shinjiro, who was ultimately killed by something that could not be beaten with strength alone. Both Akihiko and Shinjiro are alike in many ways, like their mythological counterparts, the Dioscuri. They were both running away from a past that would inevitably catch up to them. Only now, with Shinjiro's death, does Akihiko realize the folly of this mindset.
I was so focused on fighting that I didn't notice anything else. It didn't matter how tough I was. Look what happened!
Finally, he awakens to his ultimate persona, Caesar. This figure is more of a manifestation of the imperial title itself rather than the famous Roman dictator from which it derived. It's meant to reflect Akihiko's growth and maturity now that he's able to stop running from the past and forgive himself. He's now able to control his own fate like a true emperor.
Living means looking death square in the face. So I won't back down. Not even from you!
Yukari Takuba is the very first Persona user encountered in the game. She's strong-willed and independent, but also short-tempered. While she's not overly serious, she's not one to play around either, and is often unamused by the silly hijinks of the guys. At first, she comes across as a normal high school girl thrust into a very unusual double life as a member of SEES, but this isn't entirely the case. She's actually on a mission to find the truth about her father, who was killed in the Kirijo lab explosion 10 years ago. This is her reason for fighting, and why she chooses to face death as a Persona user, despite her fear. This resolve is briefly shaken after the Yakushima Island trip.
I know the whole story about my father now. But I was thinking maybe I could erase the mistakes he left behind.
Yet again, Yukari's motivation is tied to her father. She mentions how people blamed both her and her mother for the lab explosion, so it's possible that she still feels in some way responsible for the aftermath it caused. By choosing to love him unconditionally, she must also bear the guilt of his actions. This is both Yukari's strength and what keeps her bound to the past, unable to move forward. The burden of loving her father is perhaps why she has trouble coming to love anyone else, in addition to the tumultuous relationship she has with her mother, who she believes became a bad parent after the incident. She was quick to throw herself into the arms of any man that came along promising emotional support. This is the reason why Yukari herself is weary of relationships and becoming too dependent on anyone. This is something that she's able to make peace with as she develops feelings for the hero, hence her arcana, the lovers. Her initial persona is Io, a water nymph from Greek mythology who had an affair with the god Zeus. When his wife Hera found out about his duplicity, he turned her into a cow to hide her, a farm that she would be stuck in for a very long time as she travelled the world. The persona depicts Io as being shackled to the cow, symbolising how Yukari views love and dependency as things that rob her of freedom. When she later discovers the truth about her father, about how he wanted to stop Kirijo's experiments, her resolve is renewed. She no longer has to view her love as chains holding her back, and is now free to do what she believes in. This allows her to awaken to her ultimate persona, Isis, an Egyptian goddess that has many parallels to the tale of Io. Both take the form of cows and have ties to the moon, a symbol which we've already established as being intrinsic of the mother archetype. These figures could be said to be one and the same, just at different stages in life. Yukari's persona, becoming an archetypal mother goddess, represents how she's now matured and is ready to love again.
They said he died by some violent crime, right? No one knows the truth.
just like with Mom.
At first, Ken Amada seems like a respectful and unassuming young boy who only wants to do what he can to help. But this serves to hide his dark, ulterior motive. His true goal is to have his revenge on the Persona user that killed his mother. This intense desire for revenge has consumed him so completely that he has nothing else to live for. Hatred is the only thing that continues to drive him. It is perhaps for this reason that he awakened to his persona, Nemesis, the Greek goddess of divine retribution. It can also be seen as the personification of vengeance itself. It heeded his yearning to strike down those who wronged him, and is appropriately of the Justice Arcana. Nemesis is a child of Nyx, which indicates that Ken is on a destructive path to the grave, much like the members of Strega. Its mechanical design emphasizes Ken's detachment from human emotions and morality. He sees himself as a machine that functions solely to fulfill this mission. It's only when he's moments away from actually achieving this that he starts to question things. In this moment, Shinjiro represents the inevitable end of his journey, a lonely path leading to death, and Takaya represents the darker impulses that are guiding him on this path, the Shadow. He reveals that Shinjiro was going to die anyway, so his mission was always pointless.
It doesn't matter anymore. I'll never have my revenge. I have no reason to live.
I see. So you have achieved resolution.
In a way, he already had his revenge. He resigns himself to death before being saved by the very target of his revenge, Shinjiro. This too has thrown Ken's world completely upside down. The person he had directed all of his hate towards had died trying to save him, and it brought him no happiness. But this time, he wasn't empty inside. He still had the final words of Shinjiro urging him to live on and find happiness, something that had been taken from both of them when his mother died that day. Shinjiro might have been consumed by his darker impulses, which again is represented by Takaya, but Ken still has a chance. With this, he's able to forgive him and leave the past behind. He now awakens to his ultimate persona, representing his new outlook and determination to live on and defy fate. Kalanemi, the pre-Vedic spirit of the stars, the great wheel of time. This symbolizes the point where the past and the future converge. For Ken, it signifies wholeness and a connection to a future that was once out of his reach. Koromaru is a rather unusual party member. Clearly, he's a dog, a Shiba Inu to be exact. So, doing a character analysis might be a little difficult, but I'll do my best. His story is most likely inspired by true accounts of loyal dogs that never forgot their masters to the very end. Greyfriars Bobby, or Japan's own Hachiko, comes to mind. Poor Koromaru was heartbroken after his master, a monk at Naganaki Shrine, was killed by shadows. He now dutifully guards his resting place. Like the multi-headed hound Cerberus at the gates of Hades, it would become his other self. Since he's a dog and can't actually speak, except when occasionally translated by Igus, how much he truly comprehends the situation is up to interpretation. One thing is certain though, he knows that shadows are his sworn enemies. After he's wounded in battle, he's found by Seas and is brought into their ranks. His story is actually very similar to a lot of the other characters when you get right down to it. He eventually comes to realise that he isn't alone, and that he has precious bonds with other people that are worth protecting. He could be seen as the travelling companion of the Fool as depicted on the eponymous tarot card. Next we have the social links, or S-links for short. These are optional stories that can be established mostly during the daytime, and use up the main character's free time. Some of them require extra steps to unlock, such as having certain social stats high enough or already being equated with another character. There are also other S-links that rank up automatically as you progress through the story. These include the Fool, Death, and Judgment Arcana. We won't be talking about those here. With a couple exceptions, which we'll get to, the individual stories here do not have any larger meaning within the main narrative. They only loosely connect to their respective arcana. According to series director Katsura Hashino, they simply serve to represent a different step on the hero's journey through the major arcana, and reflect his personal choices and philosophy. These basically have the hero acting as a sort of therapist, listening to people's troubles and occasionally giving them some input. Often the best answers aren't the ones that are genuinely good advice though. Rather, it's the ones that gently push them to realizing the truth on their own that are ideal, much like the choices in Persona 2. It varies though, depending on the personality. Some characters like flattery, others prefer brutal honesty. In any case, the preferred choices grant the most points, which are needed to rank up the social link the next time you hang out with them. This mechanic is hidden from the player for the most part. In fact, the exact number of points is only revealed in the strategy guides, but you can tell which responses have the best effect by the musical notes over the characters' heads. More points are granted if the player has a persona of the same arcana as the S-Link. Essentially, it's all about putting on the best persona for the person or scenario. It's the same Jungian ideas used in the battle system, only in their normal, real-world context. The social links with the female characters will also lead to romance, which adds a dating sim aspect as well as an extra layer of complexity to keep in mind. These S-links will become reversed if the hero goes too long without seeing them, regardless of whether or not they're currently in a romantic relationship. Again, the exact numbers are not revealed in the game itself, but you can figure them out. Before dating, the time limit is 60 days. Once dating, it's reduced to 45. The rank at which they become romantic varies depending on the character. This is important to keep in mind because once a romance has started, they'll become jealous if you hang out with other girls. This will reduce that time limit I mentioned significantly, but it can be reset simply by hanging out with them after school or during the weekend. You don't have to worry about it at all once they're maxed. Some of the male S-links can become reversed too, but they don't have such stringent time limits. You can end up reversing one of these by double booking on a Sunday hangout. There are even some dialogue choices that can instantly lead to a reversal. If an S-link does become reversed, they can no longer be found in their usual spot. They'll be upset with the hero and will decline any invites to hang out. They'll reconsider after you pester them enough times though, which will give you an opportunity to mend the relationship. If it's a romance S-link, they'll give the hero a very stern and heartfelt talking to about their future together, a regrettable scenario for any man. Depending on your response, the relationship can be restored or made much worse. This is known as a broken S-link, and it's unique to the girls. It sounds pretty bad, but a broken S-link is functionally identical to a reversed one, and can be mended in much the same way, with a little extra effort on the player's part. The S-link cannot rank up again until this process is over, and it'll take up time during the day, so it's an unfortunate fumble to make. Interestingly, players who wish to complete all of the social links, which is possible with careful planning, may find cheating unavoidable. All of the female social links of the same age as the hero lead to romance. Platonic relationships are simply non-existent.
Men and women can't be friends because the sex part always gets in the way.
Why it was designed this way is up to interpretation, I suppose. But Hashino jokes that it may have been because they never forged a platonic relationship with a girl in real life. You can avoid cheating simply by maxing out only one of the goals in a single playthrough. Most players were never expected to get all of them anyway. Hashino even states that he wouldn't have minded if it was impossible. It's meant to be a unique experience for every player. They gravitate towards who they like and avoid who they don't. Don't stress out too much about doing absolutely everything in the game. It's about as necessary as grinding to level 99 for the final boss. Anyway, it's time we analyse the social links one by one. The Magician's social link is represented by Kenji Tomochika, the friendly and approachable classmate of the hero. He invites him out for ramen at the start of the school semester, which aptly makes him the first figure encountered by the Fool, same as his shadow counterpart. They hang out and share some idle chatter about girls. That is, until Kenji confides that he wants to ask out one of the teachers and make her his girlfriend, a quest he absolutely will not be swayed from. Kenji is determined and has initiative, just like the Fool when he sets off on his journey, but his goals are misplaced and immature, befitting the Magician. He initially considers himself an expert on women, but comes to realise that he has much to learn. I think everyone has probably known a Kenji at some point in their lives, if they're not a Kenji themselves. The Emperor's social link is represented by Hidetoshi Odagiri, a member of the disciplinary committee in the student council, which the hero can join on Mitsuru's recommendation. He will stop at nothing to find whoever has been leaving cigarette butts in the boys' bathroom, and soon comes to consider the hero his most trusted ally in this pursuit. He is, in short, a stickler for the rules. So much so that he becomes a menace to the students and the student council alike. This stems from his desire to gain leadership and a position of power, as he believes that people cannot get by on sincerity alone. However, he betrays this line of thinking when one of the teachers accuses the hero of wrongdoing. He ultimately chooses his friend over his position of power, and realises that he cannot tread over others to make his way to the top. This is the true meaning of the Emperor Arcana. Leadership that is based on trust as opposed to tyranny. In the end, he finds his culprit. Not with the threat of punishment, but with the understanding of a compassionate ruler. The Hierophant Arcana is represented by Bunkichi and Mitsuko, the kindly old couple that runs the used bookstore at the strip mall. To start it, the hero must bring them a leaf from the persimmon tree in the school's walkway. They recognise it as being from the tree that was planted by their deceased son, who was a teacher at the school. It's currently in danger of being cut down, and they fear that the memory of their son will vanish along with it. Other students even come together to save it, but in the end, the couple decides to let it happen so a new addition to the school can be built. They put aside their own happiness for the future of the children, which is why they represent the Hierophant Arcana. This is normally associated with a religious figure, like its shadow equivalent, but here it's more about someone acting as a guiding hand for the next generation. The Chariot social link is represented by Kazushi Miyamoto, a hard-working sports enthusiast with big dreams, and a member of whatever athletic team the hero joins. His goal is to win at the regional meet later in the year, but his chances become slim after a serious knee injury. He continues to train anyway, even when warned that it will only worsen his injury. He attempts to hide this from everyone but the hero, who he sees as both a friend and rival. The reason behind his irrational behaviour comes from a promise he made with his nephew, who also sustained a pretty serious leg injury. He'll go through rehab if Kazushi is able to become #1 in Japan. He has serious competition for that, I hear. When he's eventually found out, he realises that he was being irresponsible and immature. There's no sense in pushing himself so hard if it means becoming a burden on his family and friends. The Chariot represents victory for the individual, but Kazushi's victory isn't won by foolishly going it alone. It's won by realising that he's not alone and that it's okay to rely on others, which is something of a recurring theme in this game if you haven't noticed. The conqueror on the chariot cannot move forward without control of the opposing forces of the sphinxes, just as Kazushi cannot move forward without acknowledging his limitations. The Justice social link is represented by Chihiro Fushimi, the shy and self-conscious student council treasurer. She can be befriended after the hero joins the student council himself, but even then she has trouble opening up to him because of her fear of men. She isn't very confident in herself. Even her role as treasurer was given to her against her will. It's only after coming to rely on the main character that she's able to assert herself more, and this is put to the test when she's accused of stealing money from the students. Everyone is convinced it was her, and the only person she can turn to is, once again, the main character. She begrudgingly admits that she isn't strong enough to stand up for herself, and yet again has to rely on others. That is, until she becomes extremely jealous over the prospect of the hero being alone with Mitsuru, and quickly dashes to resolve the situation. In the end, it turns out to be a simple misunderstanding with a forgetful teacher. Chihiro is in a position of responsibility and is accused unfairly. She's driven to do what she thinks is right. The possessive motivations behind her actions are irrelevant. The important part is that she finally became a person who is able to stand up for what she believes is fair and just, which is what the Justice Arcana stands for. The Hermit social link begins when the hero plays the online game given to him by Junpei. In the Japanese version, this game is called Devil Busters Online and references Megami Tensei 2 as well as Digital Devil Story. In the English version though, it was changed to Innocent Sin Online, a reference to Persona 2, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense considering they're meant to take place in the same universe. At any rate, the hero becomes friends with a player who goes by the screen name Maya, Waiko in Japanese. As the two continue to play together, she reveals bits and pieces about her real life, about how she's frustrated with her job as a teacher, and how guys aren't interested in her anymore. She goes on drunken tirades about her co-workers, and even reveals that she has a crush on one of her students. The aloof one with no parents who just transferred in. Yes, really. The Hermit tarot card is often illustrated with a figure standing on a mountain peak, absorbed in introspection. They gain self-knowledge by isolating themselves from the rest of civilization. A modern equivalent of this could be someone locked in a room playing video games. Maya retreats from reality into the escapism of an MMO, where she's free to vent her frustrations to a complete stranger online. She's figuring things out bit by bit, and by the end she's ready to emerge back into civilization with a new perspective. The end of the game reveals Maya's true identity, and what ensues is a very funny scene. The Fortune social link is represented by Keisuke Hiraga, the leader of the art, music, or photography clubs, depending on which one the hero joins. He's the son of a hospital director, so he's constantly checking on everyone's well-being. He's caught between his passion for art and his father's expectations for him to follow in his footsteps. After he's able to prove himself though, his father recognizes his talents and leaves a choice up to him. Will he choose art, or will he become a doctor? It's something he goes back and forth on. Keisuke is well and truly at the crossroads of fate, the wheel of fortune. He has countless opportunities before him, and yet the one he decides on will alter his fate. This is the dilemma at the root of this social link. What he truly desires is to be the one in control of his own fate, not influenced by his father. In the end, he finds the answer for his desire to help those in need. He decides to become a doctor, but this time it's of his own volition. Strength is represented by Yuko Nishiwaki, the team manager of the athletic club. Her social link is activated during Kazushi's if you decide to walk home with her. Her story begins, perhaps intentionally, as quite aimless. She rants about her teachers, has low self-esteem, and is having some trouble with a girl picking on her. It's only when she runs into the 4th graders from her street that things start coming into place. She becomes their running coach to help them win a race against the older kids. This experience inspires her to do more coaching in future. Strength is about using love to tame ferocious passions. In Yuko's case, the children she trains could be symbolic of the lion on the strength card, and her own untapped passions in general. By concentrating the children's enthusiasm into something productive, she finds control and a sense of guidance within herself, which she then uses to decide her future. The Hanged Man S-Link is represented by a little girl by the shrine named Maiko Ohashi, who will play with the hero if he brings her a can of Mad Bull and some takoyaki. Her cheerful exterior hides a great deal of sadness over her parents' divorce, something she's still struggling to make sense of at her age. She thinks they're separating because they hate her, so she comes up with a plan to run away from home. In a way, she's putting herself in the position of the Hanged Man, a self-sacrifice to reveal hidden truths about the world. During Edogawa's class lecture, he says that this card reflects an individual's inability to take action. In Maiko's case, she's too young and immature to do anything to help her situation, but she does end up gaining a new perspective from the experience. She learns that she was wrong about the reasons for her parents' divorce, and that they do love her after all. The Temperance social link is represented by Bebe, a French foreign exchange student who is first encountered at the bookstore. He can subsequently be found sewing in the home economics room as part of the fashion club, which the hero can join to make friends with him. He loves Japanese culture and wishes to spend his life there, but after the death of his aunt, his uncle demands that he return home. With the help of the hero, he hopes to convince him to change his mind. Together, they work on a kimono that shows how much he loves his newfound homeland and how much he wants to stay. It ends up working, but in the end, he decides to stay in France for the sake of his family. This act of self-restraint, also known as the virtue of temperance, is another step towards maturity and self-actualization. Bebe has seen the larger world and is now comfortable with his place in it. The Devil's social link is represented by President Tanaka, the host of Tanaka's Amazing Commodities that plays on TV every Sunday. He can be found in person loitering around Polonia Mall at nighttime, promising to make the hero rich if he's willing to invest a small sum. If the hero is gullible enough to keep doing this, he'll eventually reveal that it was all a scam, and take him under his wing as an apprentice. No refunds though. Tanaka is a very interesting figure. There's nothing he doesn't see as an opportunity to make money, morals be damned. He didn't pull himself out of poverty by being an honest man. And not only is he aware of this fact, but he sees it as the key to his success. The main reason he took an interest in the hero is because he felt his young, handsome appearance could help hide the ugly side of his shady business. He does end up donating to charity in the end, but even this has a self-serving, ulterior motive. He wants people to be indebted to him so they'll take care of him in his old age. He thanks the hero for helping him come to this realization, even though he didn't do much of anything. The Devil Arcana is about temptation and materialism. Tanaka finds himself hoarding wealth but has nothing in life to spend it on. His story arc is deliberately comical. Instead of addressing the root cause of his greed, he just fixes one of the symptoms and continues being the same cutthroat businessman he always was. The Tower social link is represented by Mutatsu. the old monk who is first heard about from Yuko, and can be found drinking alone at the nightclub. He's initially very confused why a high school boy keeps talking to him. He is, after all, a grumpy old drunk whose wife and kid left him, but he soon becomes quite comfortable with his presence and begins rambling about his life and imparting questionable wisdom along the way. While he appears aloof, he's actually a kind man, and glimmers of that caring father and husband come to the surface every now and then. The tower is the lowest point of the fool's journey, ironically, when he believes all is lost. Likewise, Mutatsu is at the lowest point in his life. He's an old man without family or friends, drinking to fill the void. He can be seen as the ultimate cautionary tale to the hero, to make the most of his time and form strong bonds while he still can. All is not lost for Mutatsu though. Through his interactions with the hero, who strongly reminds him of his son, he realizes that he's been running away from his problems. In the end, he's able to reunite with his wife and son again and end his isolation. As I said in the previous part, the Sun Hero must descend to the darkest depths before he can rise again in full splendor. Which brings us to the next arcana. The star social link is represented by Mamoru Hayase, the rival athlete who ends up beating the hero at the regionals of whatever sport he decides to join. He's impressed with his performance and asks to hang out sometime. From here, he can be found near the takoyaki stand at the strip mall. There isn't much ego to Mamoru. He's competitive, but holds no ill will. He's more concerned about using his talent to provide a comfortable life for his family. His father died 5 years ago, leaving only his mother to take care of him and his siblings. He's quick to blame his troubles on his father's death, but soon comes to realize that he must be the one to step up and take responsibility. The star represents a shining light in the darkness, a new beginning after hardships. But the fool's struggles are not over yet, which brings us to this next social link. The Moon social link is represented by Nozomi Suimitsu, also known as the Gourmet King, first heard about from Kenji. He can be found at Polonia Mall during the day, but will refuse to talk to the hero unless he's charming enough to distract him from his sandwich. Even then, he won't trust him unless he can prove that he's a fellow gourmet by passing his quiz and feeding him an unusual food, an odd morsel. Needless to say, Nozomi is quite the glutton. His appetite is matched only by his general unpleasantness. He had a younger brother who he found himself unfavourably compared to quite often. It was because of this that he felt relieved when he suddenly died one day. But the comparisons didn't cease, and Nozomi found himself forever living in his brother's shadow. He sought to escape from everything, which is how he became a recruiter for a doomsday cult. His story, at least in small part, ties in thematically with the main story. Let's not forget the significance of the moon and its association with illusions. The latter half of the game has many people in the city buying into the idea that death is the path to salvation. This is the illusion cast on people by Nyx, whose all-encompassing influence is symbolized by the moon. Nozomi is eventually able to see through the illusion when he stops running from himself. It's doubtful this will solve his many character flaws, but his future is definitely a brighter one. Which brings us to the sun. The Sun social link is represented by Akinari Kamiki, a sickly young man who is first encountered during Maiko's social link. He's available to speak to at the shrine every Sunday after you find his lost fountain pen. Unfortunately, there's no cure for his condition, leaving him with no other option but to lament what little time he has left in the world. He's an avid reader and is clearly intelligent, and this comes through in how he is able to eloquently articulate his despair and sorrow to the hero. After a while, he comes up with the idea to channel this into writing a story about a pink alligator. He hopes that by writing an upbeat story to cheer himself up, he can find meaning in his life. But try as he might, the story only ever ends with an incomplete, sad conclusion. It's always a reflection of his sadness and uncertainty about his own meaning in life. He finds a sense of peace just before the end, comforted by the fact that everyone has to face death sooner or later, and he's just going a little sooner. In their final meeting, Akanari reveals that he finished the story, and in turn found the answer that he was looking for. The sentiment expressed is that, although he may die, what he leaves behind will be remembered by those around him. He may not find meaning in his own life, but other people will. In essence, it's his bonds with other people. He has achieved the happiness that comes with living a worthwhile and meaningful life, and he can now pass on without regrets. This is the true meaning of the Sun Arcana. Even if Akanari had a short life filled with sadness, he was still able to shine as a symbol for future generations. His legacy will be passed down by the people he touched, and by his story about a pink alligator. This is the same tranquility the hero is able to achieve at the end of his own journey. Which leads us to the final character in this analysis we're going to be taking a look at.
The sole purpose of my existence is to destroy shadows. For that reason, I was given a personality and a persona.
Aigis is a rather unusual character for the setting, but her importance to Persona 3's story cannot be understated. As an anti-shadow weapon, she was created in the image of a human girl so that she could develop a personality and summon a persona. This was made possible by her Papillion heart, which contains a plume of dusk, a fragment of Nyx that was broken off when it collided with the moon. This makes a lot of sense considering, as we saw in part 1, Nyx is the origin of individuality and the collective unconscious. Even so, when the cast initially meets Aigis at Yakushima Island, she far from passes as human. The way she acts is stiff and, well, robotic. She's a fish out of water in the real world, which leads to a lot of comical interactions with the characters. She doesn't quite grasp human thoughts and emotions, and this stops her from forming a meaningful bond with the hero. At this point, she's more of a facsimile of a human, something that's reflected by her persona, Palladion. Palladion was a wooden statue of the goddess Athena that was believed to protect the city of Troy, much like how Aigis is a replica of a human that protects the hero. But this desire to keep him safe from harm would be the catalyst of Aigis' more human tendencies. Originally, it was only the remnants of her past mission to destroy death, and likely some unconscious guilt stemming from that kept her interested in the hero. But this starts to pivot towards genuine love and affection as she begins to question things more. This leads to her gaining enough autonomy to defy her programming when Akutsuki orders her to kill him.
You are very special to me. I do not know why, but I always want to be by your side. I want to protect you.
Even though Aigis understands that she has these feelings, she still considers herself an expendable machine, for the simple fact that she cannot die like the others.
Even if I was completely destroyed, the programming data necessary to recreate me would still exist.
To Aigis, only those that can die truly possess life. Her reasoning could be considered sound, but she speaks as if she's trying to convince herself more than anything else. Are these the actions of a logical machine, or someone struggling with self-worth? The line between the two has become indistinguishable. Since Aigis views herself in this light, she can only derive her self-worth from her function. That is to say, as a machine designed to destroy shadows. But even this is taken from her when she's faced with an undefeatable enemy. Nyx.
Why fight when you know that you can't win? What is the purpose of that? Why are you wasting your lives?
She can't comprehend why the other members of FES are determined to confront such a foe when they're faced with certain death.
So then, what is my purpose now? Could someone please tell me?
Agus must derive her purpose from something more intangible than mere function. She has to leave behind the precise logic of a machine and use intuition to guide her way. She must put herself at the mercy of the same paradoxical mystery that all humans seek the answer to. She must live to find why she lives. She must live to find the meaning of life. For the first time, she finds herself on the same page as everyone else. She's no longer an inauthentic copy. She's achieved what can only be described as humanity, allowing her persona, Palladian, to evolve into its true form, the real incarnation of the goddess Athena. Agus's name actually comes from Aegis, the shield wielded by Athena. This symbolizes the purpose that Agus has found for herself in life. She wishes to be beside the hero and protect him from harm. With these new developments, she's now able to form bonds with other people, which is how the player is able to gain the Eon social link in the FES version of the game. Like Agus herself, the Eon card is a bit of an outlier. It doesn't originate from the Rider deck like the others. Rather, it's the Thoth deck equivalent of the Judgment Tarot card. It tells of great change and the potential for new possibilities and insights. This social link is something of a microcosm of the entire game's themes, and mainly follows Agus as she explores her new outlook on life. She has doubts and frustrations. She struggles with negative emotions such as jealousy. She tries to learn what it means to live from people who have never really given it much thought. This social link makes it pretty clear why a machine was chosen to convey these themes in the first place. Agus's purpose is to fight shadows, the physical representation of death, and yet death is not in her nature. Being a machine, she cannot die in the traditional sense. There's no memento mori waiting for her. It's a foreign concept that she does not understand in the abstract sense. This might be the significance of her not using an evoker in battle like the others. Remember what I said in the first part of this analysis. We must behold death, for it teaches us how to live. By that logic, it would seem that Agus is unable to learn what it means to live, but this definitely isn't the case as we've already seen. Instead, she learns the meaning of life and death through her interactions with other people, similar to the Fool. This ties back to the game's reoccurring theme of leaving your mark on the world and being remembered by those you leave behind. All of the cast in some way find strength and meaning through their connection to each other. Ultimately, we're all connected through the collective unconscious. It's the collective effort of humanity to understand the meaning of ourselves, and pass it on to the next generation through symbols. This idea is taken for granted by the living, but through Agus it's all laid bare, and it hits its crescendo in the game's epilogue. After the final battle against Nyx, everyone's memories of the Dark Hour are erased, but because of the strength of their bonds, they're able to recall their promise to reunite on the last day of school. This connection through the collective unconscious trumps the inherent laws of the universe, just as it did when they were able to defeat Nyx. Agus at last seems to know her reason for living. She wishes to remain by the hero's side until the very end. She understands that it will all end one day, and she will experience great pain and sorrow. But she's made peace with that, because that's what it means to be alive. She's at last become human. Not in a literal sense, but symbolically through her connection to others. Fittingly, the final movie shows her without any robotic parts.
Don't worry. I will always be by your side, protecting you.
ジャック・フロストが飛び出し、弾を指導口に入れることができれば、その保留のいずれかで何かが起こる。弾の色によってはアイギスのカットインが入り、焼くものが激しく回転。続けば激アツの展開に。
In the last couple parts of my Persona 3 analysis, we mainly looked at the story of the original game, as well as a bit of the new story content that was added for the FES re-release. In this part, we're delving even further into FES. We've been through the journey, now it's time to get to the answer. But first, it's important to explain what the answer actually is and why it exists. It's an extended epilogue to the original game that acts as a separate campaign within the FES edition. This was a standalone release in the West, but in Japan there was a version called the Append Edition, which required the original Persona 3 disc to function. Speaking of regional differences, the names in general are a bit different. The journey is called Episode Yourself, because you play as the character meant to represent you, and the answer is called Episode Aegis, because you play as Aegis. This epilogue clears up some of the ambiguity that was deliberately left in the original game. You might have noticed that in my Persona 3 analysis, I never actually commented on whether the main character is alive at the end or not. This is because it's left up to the player's interpretation. And it really doesn't matter anyway. Whether the protagonist dies here or lives on to become an old man is irrelevant, because he represents us, the player, and we're at the end of the game's story, which means we're at the end of his life. The game certainly drops many hints that he doesn't have long left to live. The final attack that the hero uses against Nyx consumes all of his HP, dropping him to 0. This of course would lead to a game over during normal gameplay. There's also an overwhelming fatigue that seems to catch up to the hero months after the final battle, which seems to imply that the only reason he was able to continue on was to fulfill the promise he made to meet with the others at graduation. But none of this is actually set in stone. The hero may very well be falling asleep in this scene. After all, they did manage to accomplish the impossible and triumph over death itself. So there's nothing in the themes to suggest that the hero has to die here. Ultimately, it's left up to you to decide what happens next. Until the answer came along and removed all of that ambiguity. Yeah, the P3 hero is as dead as a doornail. The impetus behind the answer is the question of what happens to Aegis. At the end of her story, she symbolically becomes human by finding a reason to live. She decides to stay by the hero's side and protect him till the very end, however long that may be. Aegis has made peace with the inevitability of death, so once again, it doesn't matter whether the hero dies here. It's a very tragic bit of irony that she decides this just as he dies, but her story always had the implication that she would live on regardless, because that's what it means to be human. The answer tells that story with Aegis as a new playable protagonist.
The day he fell asleep, we brought him back to our dorm, fear beginning to well up within us. And the next morning, our fears became reality, and he was lost to us.
She takes on the hero's role in a figurative sense, but also in a more literal way. When faced with the possibility that she may lose another friend, she summons Orpheus and gains the power of the wild card. This allows her to wield multiple personas and visit the Velvet Room, which is where another ambiguous part of the original game is touched on. Aigis is told that she can now reach the same enlightenment that the hero managed to achieve after defeating Nyx. She's now able to find the meaning of life. This was mentioned by Ryoji as something they would all come to realize one day, which seemed to hint that it would only become clear at the end of their lives. This is the conclusion that Aigis comes to as well, but the answer goes out of its way to dispel this interpretation, as we'll see later. I can see why they would want to address this part, since you only find the meaning in your life right before you're about to die is a pretty depressing thought to end on. I always thought it was left ambiguous because the meaning of life is different for every person and it isn't something simple enough to answer in a JRPG. The plot is that C's are stuck inside the dorm as March 31st repeats endlessly. They're joined by a new character named Menace, an anti-shadow weapon similar to Aigis, who explains to them that a realm known as the Abyss of Time has opened up beneath the dorm and they must explore it to find the cause. It seems to be tied to their memories, and the doors within often show events from the past that we were not originally privy to. These memories are later revealed to be tied to the reasons they became Persona users in the first place. They also chase a mysterious figure through the labyrinth who appears to be a shadow version of the hero. This happens a comical amount of times, by the way. As it turns out, this figure represents their unconscious yearning to see the hero again and their inability to move on. This is what kept the Abyss of Time around long after it should have been erased with Tartarus, and what caused the whole time loop in the first place. Both the Abyss of Time and Tartarus are stand-ins for the unconscious mind, but there are some significant differences that are worth exploring. Tartarus was a place that the characters chose to explore to better understand themselves. They always had a choice in the matter, while the Abyss of Time is something they're forced to explore. They're trapped in the dawn and in the same repeating day. This better reflects the Abyss of Time as something that was brought about by trauma, the death of the hero. It is essentially a prison of their own making, so it's only appropriate that they should be reminded of the past that brought them there. They're anxiously ruminating, trying to make sense of things, and being prevented from functioning normally until they come to terms. It's highly reminiscent of depression. You can even go as far as saying that the long stretches of monotonous grinding in this mode captures this feeling quite well. The main game dealt with the inevitability of death and how individuals perceive it, but the answer gives us a story where that inevitability has already happened. There's no calendar reminding us of the passing days. The timer has already run out, like the sand in an hourglass. The shadow of the hero is the manifestation of their regrets over how things ended, a feeling that hangs over every character in this story. Because of this, he's able to use their own personas against them in battle. It's kind of like a twisted take on the hero's wildcard ability. After he's defeated, you're treated to one of the strangest and most grotesque animated cutscenes in the entire series. It is actually quite amusing that the characters have no reaction to this. After this though, a new trial awaits. They're finally given the opportunity to escape by using the keys in each of their possession. Going through the front entrance will lead them outside, towards the future, but going through the door to the hero's room will lead them to the past, right before the final battle with Nyx. The symbolism here is pretty obvious. They can step outside and accept that the hero is gone forever, or they can go to him one more time and risk everything in a battle that may end the same way. This is what Yukari wishes to do, despite what she previously believed about wanting to move forward, and Akihiko believes that things in the past shouldn't be undone. They butt heads until it's eventually decided that the matter can only be settled through force. An indecisive Aigis has to fight everyone in the Colosseum to gain control of the keys. Metis says if Aigis loses her key, she may lose her life. which might be correct considering losing any of these fights leads to a special game over. But we don't know for sure. Even within the narrative, this is treated as a random guess based on loose logic that nobody actually believes, so I don't know why it's ever mentioned, other than to make Yukari look even more unhinged. Despite there only being 2 sides in this conflict, there's actually 4 teams fighting. Junpei and Koromaru agree with Akihiko, but are on their side, possibly because that would make it an unfair 4 against 2. These fights are a little silly in that all of your party members suddenly lose their weaknesses, and they can even use skills they didn't have before. They're just straight up cheating, I guess. All of this stuff is lost when they return to the party, of course. Meanwhile, Aiga still can't bring herself to make a decision. She doesn't want to fight, but she doesn't agree with either option either. At the beginning of the story, we find out that when the hero died, she chose to run away from her humanity instead of living with the pain. Because of this, she no longer required sleep and stopped dreaming. She returned to being just a machine. But her humanity didn't cease to exist, it just became a separate entity named Metis, who woke up lost and alone in the abyss of time, locked away with other painful memories. She behaves like a petulant child at points, which may represent how Aigis' emotional maturity is still in its infancy. She also believes herself to be Aigis' sister and is extremely protective of her. When they first meet, she insists that she equip a new set of armor. How she came across this armor, and if it's even effective, is a bit of a mystery of its own. It doesn't change the gameplay at all, and is just an aesthetic difference. But the main point is that this is Metis being overly protective of her sister. She believes it's her mission to save her, and she's even willing to hurt the other members of FES to make it happen. It's Metis' assault on FES that awakened the wild card within Aigis in the first place, as I mentioned earlier. This begs a lot of questions. Is Metis her own separate person, or is she purely a facet of Aigis? If it's the latter, it's hard not to interpret her sisterly love as a desire to love herself. More specifically, it's her human side wishing to love her robotic side to mend the schism between the two. Metis is named after the goddess of wisdom from Greek mythology. She was a wife of Zeus and the mother of Athena, Aigis' ultimate persona. This makes a lot of sense when we consider that Aigis only awakened to Athena when she came to realize her humanity. Metis is the original source of that humanity as the scared girl wanting to be loved. She has a persona of her own with Psyche, the goddess or personification of the human soul. This figure is often depicted with butterfly wings, and this carries over into her persona design as well. Butterflies are a recurring motif throughout the Persona games in general, and are usually used to represent human growth and potential for change. The death and rebirth of the psyche. It was also used earlier in this story when the shadow of the hero was defeated. Aigis' internal struggle is not too dissimilar to the difficult choice the party must make here. Neither option is pretty. They can run from the past or wallow in it. The central message of the answer, though, is that there's a middle ground to be struck between these two extremes. Facing the past is not a one-time battle, it's ongoing. It must be faced as many times as it takes, but it's also important to not be trapped in a never-ending struggle that stops you from moving forward. Sometimes you need to know when to let go. So Aigis decides to face the true source of their pain in one final battle. They go back and witness the miracle that the hero performed that day. He used his life essence to become the Great Seal and was crucified on its gates. This serves to keep Nyx from coming into contact with the accumulated malice of everyone who desired death. This is a being called Erebus, named after the personification of darkness and the husband of Nyx from Greek mythology. He's a death drive incarnate, essentially. Everything I said about Nyx in part 1 of this analysis also rings true about Erebus, and this is because Erebus is symbolically kind of redundant. Nyx already symbolized humanity's collective desire for death. We didn't really need to overcomplicate things by introducing another entity that pretty much symbolizes the exact same thing, but this creature serves as the answer's final boss. It's the death they all desired in their hearts after the hero passed away, so it's quite appropriate that it's fought inside a memory of the past. Like an Ix, it's a being that can never truly be defeated until humanity stops yearning for death. But by overcoming it themselves, they've proven that it's possible for anyone to do, giving hope for everyone's futures. With this, Igus is finally able to accept the humanity she wished away and confront the pain of living. This transforms her into something between human and a machine. She's able to remain herself even after her synaptic circuits are burned out. This begs a lot of questions, the most pressing of which is why this line of dialogue is spoken by Akihiko but voiced by Mitsuru.
Is that it?
In Japanese, it's correctly voiced by Akihiko, so I guess this is just a funny mix-up in the English dub. Igus is able to find the answer to life's greatest question that Ryoji spoke of at the end of the original game. It's the same thing you, the player, was meant to take away from the game. Bonds with other people. It's this that allows her to continue on and, hopefully one day, change humanity's yearning for death and free the hero's soul from the Great Seal. That's the story. There isn't really a lot of it compared to the main game. Most of the answer's 30-hour runtime is spent dungeon crawling. There's a lot of story in the beginning and a lot of story at the end, but not much in between. It removes some of the ambiguity from the original game and overcomplicate things just a bit. There's a compelling argument to be made that this story was never needed at all. For this reason and others, the answer wasn't well liked when it was first released in Japan, and still continues to be a contentious part of the series to this day. Many fans didn't like the writing and characterization. We spent an entire game seeing these characters forge unbreakable bonds, and now here they are squabbling and fighting with each other. By design, this scenario puts the characters to the ultimate test. It's contrived in such a way where fighting and considering unreasonable solutions are the only options given to them. Furthermore, the characters act seemingly numb to the hero's death in the beginning, especially with Igus where it's a major plot point, so it's easy to feel a disconnect. The knee-jerk reaction is to find it all a bit insulting as a fan. Personally, I didn't like this scenario when I first played it, and I still don't like it much now. But I think there is an argument to be made that the characterization at least makes sense when you really think about it. All of the characters behave in unexpected ways, but they are dealing with grief after all. No character exemplifies this more than Yukari, who, alongside Igus herself, could be seen as the main heroine of the answer. She also tends to get the brunt of the hate from fans for her actions. Firstly, it's important to clarify that only Yukari and Igus are in love with the hero in this story. There's no mention of Mitsuru and Fuka having feelings for him, which could mean that their max social links have been partially retconned, or the hero just never did them in this universe. This is important to understanding Yukari's downright hysterical actions in the answer. She's extremely bitter and jealous that Igus is the one who inherited the hero's power and not her. She comes across as very callous and unlikable, which is very much unlike how she was at the end of the main game.
I want to see him! I don't care about anything else! I just want to see him again!
Realistically though, it does make a lot of sense that Yukari would want to risk everything to save the hero. We saw in a social link that love does not come easy to her, and she's very resistant to the idea. She never wanted to become like her mother, who would seek comfort by throwing herself at men. She wanted to become the opposite of this by being independent and finding her way on her own. This is even highlighted in the answer when we see into her memories related to why she became a Persona user in the first place. She's been trying to discover the truth behind her father's death for 10 years without anyone else's help. This all changed though when she came to love and trust the protagonist. He was someone she found herself relying on more and more. Suddenly, she was no longer alone to carry the burden. But just as soon as this happened, he was taken away from her without a proper explanation. She wanted to move on, but found that she couldn't. It's the same scenario as when she lost her father, so of course she wouldn't be able to just give up and move on. That's simply not in her nature. With this in mind, it's easy to see why she did what she did. Although once again, it is very easy to find Yukari unlikable here. It isn't just her life she's gambling with, it's everyone's. It's worth keeping in mind that just because a character's actions might make sense within the narrative, you don't necessarily have to like it. So I think a lot of the negative reactions are pretty understandable. The answer was the most significant bit of new story content added in FES, but there are also some additions in the main game as well, such as Aigis' Eon social link, which we already discussed in the previous part. Since there's a new Arcana in the game, now that means there's a new set of personas associated with it. Metatron was originally of the Sun Arcana, but now becomes the ultimate persona of Eon. And Anta and Uriel were also moved here from their respective Arcana in the original game. There was a bunch of new personas added to FES in general, bringing the persona count from 145 to 169. We may as well take a look at all of them. A new version of Lucifer was added that uses his more demonic nocturne design. To differentiate the two, the old Lucifer was renamed to Halel, the Hebrew name of Lucifer. There's a brand new hard mode on the difficulty select. The extra dungeon Monad has different unlock conditions now. Originally you just had to reach the top of Tartarus for it to open, but now you have to defeat the Reaper for one of Elizabeth's requests. These are kinda like optional side quests that you can activate in the Velvet Room. We'll talk about those in more detail later, but the important part for now is that FES added more of them, including fun events where you get to show Elizabeth around the town. Some of these new requests unlock new outfits, such as the maid costumes for the girls. There's also some new events in the evening where you can take Koromaru for a walk with the other characters. An odd side event was added involving broken equipment in the command room. For some reason, Mitsuru asks the hero and even Junpei to take a look at it to see if they can fix it. Why would you ever ask Junpei to fix anything? Shaky logic aside, the hero can come here to peek in on his dorm mates using the security cameras. There's some funny fanservice scenes to be found here. A new service was added at the Shinshoujo antique store where the owner will fuse weapons with personas, provided they have the needed nihil materials, which was also added. This can be used to create a lot of unique and powerful weapons. It'll take her a few days to make them though, rendering it inaccessible on the last day of the game. Finally, there's a special new event that involves bringing Chidori back to life. The hero must find Junpei on certain days and encourage him not to give up on her while she's in the hospital. If done correctly, there'll be some new scenes on January 21st. Chidori is alive, but she no longer has her persona and doesn't remember anything from the past year, including her relationship with Junpei. This, along with another event from Portable involving Shinjiro, tends to get criticized for going against the themes of the game. A common misinterpretation with this game's message in general is that it's about accepting death. This is only half true. It's about accepting that death is inevitable, but also hanging on to life and living it to its fullest before that happens. Death comes for all, but not today. Remember, the characters do end up defeating death itself at the end of the story, so it's not going against the themes to give you the option to save some of the characters.
If more people were like you, then perhaps the fall could have been prevented.
Although, we will seemingly never have an option to save the Persona-free protagonist himself. We haven't really gone too deeply into Persona 3's gameplay yet, so that's what the rest of this part is going to be about. Some of this will be very relevant for the next part when we take a look at how the PSP version changed things. There was a major shift in game design that happened during that long gap between Persona 2 and 3. It can be traced back to Atlus's first real outing on the PS2, Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, a game that Katsura Hashino also directed. This game introduced the press turn battle system, which placed heavy emphasis on hitting enemy weaknesses to gain extra turns. This brought elements of the battle system that were previously in the background to the forefront. Paying attention to strengths and weaknesses was no longer optional. It was life or death. This design philosophy came to define a lot of Atlus's JRPGs during the 6th generation, and its influence can still be felt to this day. Persona 3 had its own take on this with the One More system, which, as its name suggests, gives party members one more turn for hitting an enemy's weakness or getting a critical, provided they're still standing. This knocks down an enemy, denying them a turn, and if every enemy is knocked down, an all-out attack can be performed for huge damage. This is what you want to be aiming for in every battle where it's possible. An all-out attack, or any attack while the enemy is downed, will allow them to recover, so sometimes it can be strategically advantageous to hold off. Some enemies don't have weaknesses, but you can still knock them down using a couple different methods. You can hit a critical attack, which has a much higher chance of landing if the enemy is afflicted with certain status ailments, such as panic, distress, fear, and shock. Shock happens when using electricity magic. In the original game, this merely increased the chance of a critical, but in FES it's guaranteed, making it incredibly effective against the Reaper. Knockdowns can also occur when a non-projectile physical attack misses its intended target. These type of knockdowns don't grant one mores, but they can still be used to initiate an all-out attack. This is an exception to the rule, since usually a one more must beget an all-out attack. For example, if the last enemy standing is killed by anything other than an attack that would lead to a one more, no all-out attack will be initiated. It's worth noting that one mores are only granted if every attack knocks down its target. Multi-targeting skills have a harder time doing this since the chances of missing are much higher. These same rules apply to the player as well, as does everything I've mentioned here with the exception of all-out attacks. The enemy cannot do those. With the exception of Shinjiro and Metis, every party member has a strength and a weakness. The AI will exploit this if you let it, especially in the answer where they somehow know right at the start of the battle. Ideally, each persona's strengths, weaknesses, and skill set should be tailored to whatever boss fight you're currently facing. While you can just switch out party members depending on the encounter, this often isn't viable for one very important reason. Your unused party members are most likely going to be a much lower level. The game does grant them an experience boost to mitigate this somewhat, but you're still going to be doing a lot of grinding to catch them up. Sometimes it's better to just power through these encounters using armor and accessories that boost a character's evasion against the element they're weak to. Some accessories in the late game can nullify weaknesses entirely. These are usually acquired through an item-bearing persona. This game has far less elements than the Persona 2 duology, making things a bit more simplified. We have the four main elements comprising of fire, ice, electricity, and wind. After this we have light and dark, which are used exclusively for the instant death magic such as hammer and mudo. When in doubt, it's a good idea to have a persona that resists at least one of these, especially since the protagonist's death means an immediate game over. You can survive this if you have a homunculus in your inventory. This will give its life in your stead. Next we have the three types of physical damage: slash, strike, and pierce. This corresponds to the different types of weapons in the game. Junpei has a sword, so he inflicts slash. Akihiko fights with his fists, so he inflicts strike. Yukari has a bow, so she inflicts pierce. All three of these can also be found in physical persona skills, which unlike other skills do not consume SP. They instead use a percentage of your HP. The hero is the most versatile in this area, and it's not just because he's the only one who can change his persona. He's also the only one who can equip any type of melee weapon, with the exception of Koromaru's kunais and Aigis' firearms. These determine his attacks outside of battle when roaming Tartarus as well. The final element is Almighty. It isn't counted among the regular elements because it falls outside of the rules of the game to some degree. You can't be weak or strong against it. The climb to the top of Tartarus is a treacherous one that will take Seas an entire year. There are over 250 floors spread across 6 blocks, and the layouts are randomly generated upon entering. No 2 floors will ever be exactly the same, even if you've already been there before. There'll always be different treasures and hazards. Sometimes you might get lucky and have a floor with nothing but gold shadows carrying valuable items, or a floor where the stairs leading up are right by where you started. Other times though, you can get unlucky and have long, winding dungeons densely populated with shadows. Unlike the previous games, the battles are not random encounters. You can see the shadows on the map, and how you approach them determines your initiative in battle. Hitting them from behind when they're unaware will give player advantage, where every character will get an extra turn in before the enemy. Being ambushed by the enemy will have the opposite effect. The decision of ambushing shadows or running past them is one of the most interesting things about Persona 3's dungeon crawling. Attacking first is obviously much safer, while running past them risks backing you into a corner. Still, if you're low on SP and items, the latter might be your only chance at survival. There are teleporters that will send you back to the entrance so you can refill HP and SP and save your progress. However, this means abandoning whatever progress you've made through the tower since the last boss floor. You can lose a lot of progress if you die, so this is the constant dilemma you'll find yourself in. It definitely adds a level of challenge that had been missing from the series since the first game. Except for the locations you visit to fight the full moon shadows, Tartarus is the only dungeon in the game. It's optional for the most part until Seas has to fight Nyx on the final day, so deciding when to explore it and for how long is left up to the player. In the early game, the strain of the Dark Hour will very quickly tire out the characters and leave them worse for wear. The lower their level, the less battles they're able to fight until they get tired. Once they become tired, they'll take more damage and will have a harder time recovering after a knockdown. If this happens to a party member, they'll leave for the evening when you walk back to the entrance. This will also happen if you leave behind a KO'd party member without reviving them. Without a full party, it's best just to call it a night and come back another day. To recover from the tired status, the hero has to either sleep during class or earlier in the evening. In both cases, he'll miss out on an opportunity to increase his knowledge from studying. He can, however, visit Edogawa in the nurse's office to try one of his strange concoctions. It won't help at all, but the hero will gain courage for having the guts to try it. Being tired comes with the risk of getting sick. This is the worst status any character can be afflicted with. Their attack, defense, evasion and critical rate will all be down, and healing will only be half as effective on them. Needless to say, exploring Tartarus like this is a death sentence. The game is merciful enough to revert this status when you're about to fight a full moon boss, and on the final day you can't get tired at all. There's a few unspoken safety nets like this to ensure that you don't accidentally make the game unwinnable for yourself. The answer doesn't have these mechanics at all, since there is no calendar to keep on top of. Alternatively, a well-rested hero can get the Great status, which will significantly increase a character's evasion and critical rate. While exploring Tartarus, you're actually able to give your allies commands. You can tell them to split up and scout out the floor on their own. They'll report to you if they find the stairs and will give you any items they find, except for money. They keep this for themselves and use it to purchase equipment from the store. This is a bit of an obscure mechanic that not many people know about, but it's why characters will sometimes change their equipment and return whatever you gave them. You can, and probably should, tell them to stick with the gear you chose for them. Who do they think the brains of this outfit is? Party members also have their own inventory of items that is inaccessible to the player. This is why they can still use medicine and medical powder when the protagonist doesn't have any himself. Splitting up can be quite dangerous though, since they can still be attacked by shadows. If your party members are too far away from you when entering a battle, they won't be able to help you. Fusion spells make a return from Persona 2, except now only the main character can use them and they work a bit differently. These will be listed as skills when you have two personas that have some synergy with each other. This is usually because they're tied together in mythology in some way, or have some commonality between them. For example, Loki and Susanoo are paired together because they're both tricksters. They can be used to inflict random status ailments on enemies. The King and Queen of the Fairies, Oberon and Titania, have an extremely unpredictable spell that can do a number of things. Phornius and Decorabia have a fusion spell called Best Friends, which is actually just a reference to their odd friendship in Nocturne. It's able to put all the buffs on one character. A lot of these are gimmicky and easy to ignore. They're certainly not as essential to regular gameplay as the ones from Persona 2. The most powerful of these is the Armageddon fusion spell, which can insta-kill the Reaper, the final phase of Nyx, and is necessary for defeating Elizabeth. For some reason, fusion spells aren't usable by Aigis in the answer, even though she should have the same powers as the hero.
Keep up the good work!
Occasionally, at the end of battles, something called Shuffle Time will activate. This is a sort of minigame where you can pick up tarot cards that will give you a number of things. HP and SP recovery, experience boosts, equipment, and money. And blank cards that will give you nothing. Cards with skulls on them can still be collected normally, but they'll bring the Reaper closer to appearing. This is also where you can get new personas, which are usable right out of the gate, but can be fused in the Velvet Room to create stronger ones. A persona's stats will become the hero's stats. Unlike the previous games, he has no stats of his own that will be calculated against his persona's stats. Except for his level, which does seem to grant characters extra offense and defense, but the extent of this is completely hidden from the player, possibly for the sake of keeping things nice and simple. The Velvet Room functions a lot differently than previous entries. In fact, it's now much closer to the Cathedral of Shadows from the SMT games. The fusion result is determined by the persona's arcana and base level. That is to say, the level it originally had, not counting any additional leveling the player might have done. A level 99 Orpheus will only ever count as level 1, but usually the resulting persona will be a higher level than the ingredients used to create it. A fused persona can gain experience points based on the rank of its arcana's social link. They can also bear items, as indicated by this love heart symbol. Personas of course come with their own innate skills and ones that are unlocked by leveling them up, but they can also inherit skills from fusion. The number of skills inherited is determined by the total number of skills across the fused personas. Anything less than 6 will only allow one skill to be inherited. The number of skills in the pool will naturally be higher if we use a triple fusion, or something higher than even that, but these are a bit rarer. The skills will be randomly chosen every time the selection is made. You may not get everything you want, so you'll just have to compromise every now and then. The inherited skills aren't completely random though. There are some hidden rules governing what skills can and can't be inherited and how likely they are to occur. A persona with an affinity for a certain element are more likely to inherit skills of that element, and will not be able to inherit skills from the other 3 elements. Outside of this is a persona's preference for light and dark magic. It goes without saying that a persona with an affinity for light cannot learn dark magic and vice versa. However, if they don't have an affinity for either, they can learn both. Personas that use physical attacks are unlikely to inherit magic at all. Personas with an affinity for healing cannot inherit physical attacks. There are personas that break these rules and can inherit any skills, but they are much more rare to come by. Skill inheritance is the most important thing to pay attention to if you're going to be creating powerful personas. It has you planning several steps ahead. It allows a higher degree of customizability than ever. Because of this, you'll probably want to save your creations, and this can be done using the thing this series got its name from, the Persona Compendium. Personas can be resummoned from here for a price. This is sadly not available in the answer, and neither is the experience boost from social links since they don't exist in the answer either. Aigis really doesn't get much to work with. She doesn't get any of Elizabeth's requests either, which are plentiful in the main game. There's around 100 of them, but a lot of them follow similar archetypes. Some have time limits, some do not. There are the simple fetch quests that have you searching for certain items or equipment. It's usually something dropped by an enemy in a certain block of Tartarus. Sometimes though, what you need has to be found outside the Dark Hour by asking around, usually during certain days that Elizabeth tells you about. One of the weirder ones is where you have to equip a scrub brush and clean the Port Island Station bathrooms. Some requests have you performing fusion spells or showing her a persona with a certain skill or level. Every time a new block of Tartarus opens up, there'll be an old document waiting at the top. They contain a few tidbits of interesting lore concerning the origins of Tartarus. Elizabeth always has a request to find these and give them to her before a certain date. The final request in the game is number 55, Defeat the Ultimate Opponent, which can only be done in New Game Plus. This has you facing off against Elizabeth at the top of Monad in what is, undoubtedly, one of the hardest JRPG boss fights of all time. There's a few unspoken rules that must be followed in this fight. Breaking any of them results in Elizabeth spamming Diarahan and Megidolian, making the fight effectively unwinnable. First of all, it must be fought alone. Well, not counting Fuka, who you can't get rid of anyway. The fight must not exceed 100 turns. The player is not allowed to nullify, reflect or drain any of Elizabeth's attacks, with the exception of ailments. You can use a persona that has these resistances as long as it isn't used against her at some point. In the same vein, you're not allowed to use magic or attack mirrors either. You are, however, allowed to resist her attacks, and you absolutely must because anything less will pretty much one-shot you. Yes, even with maxed out stats and the best equipment in the game. Elizabeth is not messing around. As long as you follow the rules, she will cycle through the same pattern of personas every time. She takes 2 actions per turn. These actions will either be a physical attack or a magic attack that's dependent on the persona she's using. The 8th persona in this sequence will always be a double dosage of Megidolian, which is only survivable with the fusion spell Infinity. This will make you invincible for 1 turn. Elizabeth starts the fight with 20,000 HP. If you knock her below 10,000, she'll use a full heal on the next available turn. Yes, a full heal. This will reset your progress and will probably make it unwinnable at that point. What you have to do is knock her below 10,000 HP and then use the fusion spell Armageddon, which is the only spell in the game that will do enough damage to defeat her at this point. And don't get any funny ideas about using it at the start of the fight. This is also part of the unspoken rules. So, you might have noticed a bit of a problem. How do you knock her below 10,000 and then use Armageddon if she always heals on the next turn? It can only be done by countering her own physical attacks, which ensures that the damage is dealt during Elizabeth's turn and not yours. You have to get her to as close to 10,000 as possible and then wait for that to happen. But you better hope that happens during her second attack and not her first. If it happens during the first, she'll just heal on the next. Yeah, this fight is half preparation, half luck. No matter how good your setup is, there's always the risk of it all going wrong. The reason for this fight in the first place is because Elizabeth wishes to understand herself. Like everyone else who has entered the Velvet Room, she's on a mission to find her identity. She hopes that by fighting a strong opponent, she will find the answer.
Wait, I am mistaken. The answer is this. Only I can decide who I am.
Now that we've looked at everything surrounding the first 2 releases of Persona 3 on the PS2, it's time to get to Persona 3 Portable. That means we're going to be looking at everything that was changed, removed and added. This port came from that era when Atlus were putting a lot of the mainline Persona games on the PSP, for better or worse, as you may have seen in my previous analysis videos. The PSP's UMD format only allowed for a maximum of just under 2 GB of data, which is considerably less than the DVDs that most PS2 games, including Persona 3, were released on. This wouldn't have been an issue with the PSP ports of the original trilogy, since they were PSX games. but with Persona 3 they had to do some creative workarounds to make it possible. This makes it the most unique of all the PSP ports, and definitely the one they put the most effort into. Needless to say, there's a huge graphical downgrade that is readily apparent if you've seen both versions. The 3D exploration outside of Tartarus has been removed and replaced with 2D backgrounds and sprites. You navigate these like it's a point-and-click adventure game, and the portrait of the main character is permanently judging you. But aside from this, these function like they do in the original version. There's a speed up button and a fast travel menu so you can get around quicker. There's these weird checkerboard patterns outside of the boundaries of areas. It looks very Sonic-esque. The cutscenes also no longer take place in a 3D space with character models. They're all rendered like a visual novel, with extra bits of text so you can follow along what happens. This isn't quite as effective, and you definitely lose some of the impact those original scenes had. This is most noticeable during scenes that used to be stylishly animated by point pictures. These were always a little low budget looking, and sometimes there were even weird mistakes, like the hero inexplicably appearing twice in this scene, but they more than made up for it with striking imagery and mood. Since full motion video takes up a huge amount of space, they've been mostly omitted in Portable, save for a few moments where still images from them were used. They're now either in this new visual novel format, or using in-engine graphics that attempt to emulate them. They're never quite as stylish or impactful though. The opening to the game had this oppressive atmosphere thanks to its sound design and editing. Portable does a poor job of translating this to its new slideshow format, and since storytelling can no longer happen through visuals alone, we now have new bits of dialogue that outright tell us. Much of the impact from the hero's first Persona summoning has been greatly diminished. The suspenseful build-up is gone, Pharos no longer tempts the hero into using the evoker, and we don't get the close-up on his twisted smile. These are all important parts of the storytelling, so it's sad to see them gone. Some of these cutscenes are a bit silly looking when placed next to their original animated equivalents. It really goes to show that there was a good reason they animated these sequences in the first place. The new illustration of the hero when he was younger is comically low quality. Somehow it's even worse with the female protagonist. We never see the hero descend from the moon after the final battle, which is a strange thing to leave out. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you how much of a shame it is that the final animated sequence is missing. Even Aigis' smile during the post-credits scene is gone. There's even important music tracks missing from the end of the game, such as Nyx's theme song, no, not the final boss music, the track just titled Nyx, as well as the song that plays when the hero ascends to the moon. This track included another rendition of the Tartarus music, one that had a bit more of a transcendent feel to it, but Portable just reuses one from earlier in the game instead. The small cameo from Persona 1's leitmotif when Akutsuki falls off of Tartarus is missing too, as well as numerous others. The thing all of these bits of missing music have in common is that they accompanied animated scenes. It's odd that they weren't used for the new scenes that replaced them, especially when we take into account that a lot of new music was added to the game as well, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It isn't all bad though. Since a lot of the 3D models of minor characters were omitted, brand new portraits were drawn for them. This includes all of the teachers, the girls during Operation Beipun, the doctor, Michael's parents, Mitsuru's fiancé, the old woman and her cat from Aigis' social link, and some others. There are also some portraits for the main characters that didn't exist in the original game, such as Aigis being completely trashed, Aigis crying, Takaharu Kirijo dying on the ground, Shidori dying on the ground, Shinjiro dying on the ground, which is also occasionally used for his more vulnerable moments. Shinjiro blushing, Junpei tied up, Takaya holding a gun, Takaharu Kirijo holding a gun, and Akutsuki holding a gun. There are also these new illustrations that show up during all-out attacks, instead of the old ones which just reuse their regular portraits. While the areas you explore during full moons are mostly intact, even these aren't without some strange omissions. The long run up to the monorail is gone. The characters just show up there now without it. This was always one of the more visually striking moments from the game that intentionally emphasized Tartarus looming over the city, so its absence does a bit of a disservice to the atmosphere and general scope of the game. Portable retains all of the content from the FES version of Persona 3, with the exception of the answer. This means that you still have the Eon social link, the command room footage, the Chidori revival event, the extra personas, and so on. If it was in FES, Portable has at least some altered version of it. An HD remaster of Portable was released for modern systems in 2023, and believe it or not, this version has its own list of pros and cons. The 2D backgrounds have been upscaled with AI and now look incredibly ugly. Just take a look at that hideous calendar in the hero's room. It's a smeary mess. There are times when it looks like vomit. There are times when it makes me want to vomit. Huh. If only there was a version of this game that used 3D graphics instead of 2D ones. It might have held up a little better. The character portraits fare much better, but can sometimes look a bit off. You never notice the odd shades of white in characters' eyes until they're blown up to this resolution. It's a bit uncanny and off-putting. On a positive note, this version runs in higher frame rates, loads quicker, and allows us to freely switch between English and Japanese voices for the very first time. An option called Equipped Persona Memory was added that reverts your persona back to the one you had equipped before the battle. Very convenient if you like using the auto buffs on certain personas. A text backlog was added, a feature that has become quite common in modern Persona games. There are some other differences that I'll bring up later as they become relevant. Since this newer version is much higher resolution, it's what you'll mostly be seeing throughout this video. Aside from this though, it's still Persona 3 Portable with all of the downsides that entails. Portable is much more than just a watered down port of the original though, as I'm sure you're already somewhat aware of. There's a huge amount of quality of life changes and new content for us to sink our teeth into. A good chunk of this is exclusive to a brand new route. You're now given the option, upon starting a new game, to play as the original male hero or a new female one. The male route sticks very closely to the original game, possibly for the sake of people playing for the very first time, whereas the female route feels like something of a remix with a lot of new options that keeps things fresh for returning fans. There was a huge effort made to not make it feel like a tacked-on experience. It's not just a lazy gender flip, it's a full reimagining of what this story would have been if the hero was a woman. Her relationship with certain characters is fundamentally different than the males. She's treated differently, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in much bigger ways. In a game that's all about bonds with other people, this becomes very interesting indeed. To make it so that I'm not saying male hero and female hero so much, I'm just going to use their generally accepted names from here on. Makoto for the male hero and Kotone for the female hero. It's worth keeping in mind that the difference between these two protagonists is more than just their sex. They may fill the same role within the story, but they're treated as two different people. They don't share the same personality, something that's reflected by their different dialogue choices. You'll need to look at them side by side to pick up on that. It makes a lot of sense that people would be more willing to open up to the girl on the right. I would argue though that this difference misses the subtle character arc that the protagonist goes through. Everything about Makoto's appearance communicates that he's aloof and detached from people. This is the significance of the headphones we always see him wearing. He's in his own insular world. It was definitely not a coincidence that he's our avatar in a story where strength is derived from bonding with other people. You don't quite get this impression from Kotone though, even if she does have her own pair of headphones. She looks very outgoing and approachable already. Still, it is interesting how she's perceived differently by others. There's now an element of sexism to Junpei's unwillingness to accept Kotone as their leader, something that Mitsuru is very quick to chastise him for. Another example is Yukari being a lot more comfortable letting Aigis share Kotone's bedroom now that they're both girls. Kotone is generally friendly with the female characters in much the same way that Makoto is with the male ones. This is established pretty early on when you walk home with Yukari instead of Junpei. Yukari's social link can also be started much sooner and without the charm requirement. She's unable to forge the same kind of brotherly bond with the guys though, obviously, and because of this, she's unable to take part in things like Operation Babe Hunt. This event still happens in this route, but we no longer get to take part. This also means that the way the hero first meets Aigis is slightly different as well. We now get to be on the other side of the Kyoto Hot Springs event. We can either choose to catch the guys hiding there or give them the opportunity to escape. While we're on the subject, this event is a bit different in both routes. The 3D gameplay has been removed, so now you're only able to influence the events through choices. During the second full moon operation at the school, Kotone has the option to partner with Akihiko instead of Yukari, although she can still partner with Yukari if she chooses to. There are numerous small additions like this that give Kotone a lot more fan service moments than Makoto, whose route again sticks closely to the original game. At the Love Hotel, there's actually two possible characters you can end up being tempted with: Akihiko and Junpei. This is determined by which of them you bring with you into the Hierophant boss fight. The special holiday events will also have some different options just for Kotone. At the summer festival, she's able to hang out with Akihiko, Junpei, Yukari and Fuka, or Mitsuru and Aigis. At Christmas, she's able to hang out with Yukari and Fuka, or spend some precious moments with Akihiko or Ken. Yeah, she has very different romance options from Makoto, and these are explored in some of the new social links available to her. This includes Akihiko, Ken, Shinjiro, and Ryoji. None of them become jealous if you hang out with other guys. In fact, the whole jealousy mechanic in general no longer exists, even for Makoto. For whatever reason though, the red text that warns you about it is still there. Hang out with as many girls as you like, the social link will never reverse. Since it's impossible to double book on the weekends now as well, you can't reverse social links that way either. However, social link reversals aren't completely gone. They can still happen if you make particularly bad choices. Chihiro's can still be reversed if you try to kiss her, and Akihiko's can be broken entirely if you lead him on and then reject him. Despite having an S-link this time around, Junpei is not romanceable, for obvious reasons. But Kotone can still confess her feelings for him during their conversation on the roof towards the end of the game. Or she can keep things purely platonic, which is always an option during her social links. This is a bit of game design that this re-release inherited from Persona 4, and curiously, it doesn't transfer over to Makoto's route. It creates a bit of inconsistency, but again they were trying to keep his route as close to the original vision as possible, where, as we all know,
men and women can't be friends because the sex part always gets in the way.
Is there perhaps some significance, some deeper meaning to a woman wanting to pursue a platonic relationship but not a man? We may never know. Makoto isn't without his own bits of new fan service either. During New Game Plus, your hero is able to spend his or her final moments with their one true love. A new option will appear, asking the player whose voice they hear in the distance. Makoto is able to choose between Yukari, Fuka and Mitsuru, provided their S-links have been maxed and romanced. Kotone instead gets Akihiko, Ken, and Shinjiro? Yeah, I'll get around to explaining that one in just a bit. These alternate endings are a nice bit of fan service, but in each of them it's hard not to feel bad for Aigis. This is probably why it's exclusive to New Game Plus though.
Starting now. We'll never be apart.
From now on, I'll look after you.
I'm glad I met you.
A feature that's exclusive to Kotone is being able to choose her Velvet Room attendant. Ego will ask you in the beginning to guess if they're a man or a woman. Answering with the latter will get you Elizabeth, and the former will get you her brother, Theodore. This doesn't change things much besides giving Kotone a romanceable Velvet Room attendant of her own, and something else we'll take a look at later. Anyway, it's time to take a look at Kotone's social links, starting with the ones that are shared with Makoto but have some notable differences. As I previously mentioned, she's able to start Yukari's social link much earlier. In the original game, this was started after the hero's tender moment with her at Yakushima Island. She decides to open up to him after this point, but with Kotone it's a much more casual affair. Regardless, they bond over their similar circumstances, having both lost parents. From here, it progresses in a similar way as it did for Makoto until we get to the part where the romance comes in. Yukari's story becomes more about the general fear of losing people close to her, a trait that she shares with her mother. She's able to get over this after forging a close friendship with Kotone, which gives her the confidence to start looking for a boyfriend. She gets to the same place in the end, just slightly differently. Fuka is very much the same way. Since her social link is about connecting with others, it doesn't change too much with a female protagonist, besides the inability to romance her. Mitsuru's, on the other hand, has a new and interesting twist during its second half. She laments how being born a woman has given her less control over her own life as an heir of the Kirijo group. On some level, she fears that she's just a puppet with no will of her own, and this becomes her motive for making the protagonist leader in the first place. She secretly hoped that she would show to her that there is no difference between men and women, and that she too can take control of her own fate. Considering how both protagonists are able to reach the same conclusion in their respective routes, she may have been more right than she could have ever realised. There are differences in all of the social links Kotone shares with her male counterpart, but they don't really change things much. She has more of a sisterly bond with Maiko. Hidetoshi falls in love with her, and so does Bebe. But Akanari, Tanaka, the old couple, and Mutatsu are pretty much identical. Mutatsu even still drunkenly mistakes her as his son in one scene, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He does have a new line of dialogue that acknowledges the absurdity of this though, so the immersion is never broken, something I suspect was a high priority while we were making this route. The Eon social link is also mostly unchanged, but this is mainly because Aigis has unconditional love for the protagonist regardless of their sex. It also helps that she's a machine and isn't well versed in societal norms in the first place. Now let's take a look at the new S-links with characters we know quite well. The male party members of SEES, starting with Junpei, the new face of the Magician social link, replacing Kenji. Just like Kenji, the first rank happens automatically near the start of the game when he invites you out for ramen. As Kotone, we get to see a different side of him, a different persona, if you will. He's not quite as goofy or careless as he typically lets on, and he certainly isn't as pervy as Operation Babe Hunt and the Kyoto Hot Springs incident would lead you to believe. The Junpei we see here is closer to the one we saw during his interactions with Chidori. He's a bit more protective and vulnerable. He tries to solve the mystery of who's been taking pictures of Kotone without her permission and spreading them around the school. Junpei is a character who acts carefree, but is very concerned about finding meaning and purpose in his life. This often manifests in a slightly unhealthy devotion to the opposite sex, and he comes to realise this at the end of the social link, allowing him to forge a genuine bond of friendship with Kotone. Akihiko becomes the new representative of the Star social link, replacing Mamoru, despite the fact that he's normally of the Emperor Arcana. In the original version, social links with party members match the Arcana of their personas. There's no rule that says a character can't represent multiple Arcana, but it does feel like they're starting to cheat at this point. Anyway, Akihiko can be befriended after school once Kotone has enough charm. He's initially the cool older senpai looking out for you. He proudly proclaims that, unlike Junpei, he won't go easy on you just because you're a girl. But this facade begins to crumble a bit once you get to know him better. He's obsessed with becoming strong, but when it comes to women, he has to admit that he's a little hopeless. This goes deeper than him being an eccentric guy though. It's suggested that his aloof personality is a means to keep people away, so he doesn't have to worry about losing anyone again like he did his sister. Kotone eventually becomes someone he fears losing, but instead of running away, he finally learns to embrace it. This gives him the strength to continue on, like a light shining in the darkness, which may be why this social link is represented by the Star Arcana. Next, let's take a look at the Strength social link, which is represented by Yuko and Makoto's route. This one can be started in the evening after obtaining dog food from the cooking club. It's Koro-chan, and his story here is pretty much what I surmised it as all the way back in part 2. The members of SEES can never become substitutes for his master, but he comes to rely on them as friends to mend his broken heart. After that, we have the Justice social link, now represented by Kenemada instead of Chihiro. It can be started in the evening when Kotone has max courage. The age gap here creates a bit of a strange dynamic between the two. It really seems to emphasize Ken's immaturity. He even starts to see Kotone as a sort of mother surrogate, which makes it all the more strange when he begins to develop feelings for her. I didn't talk about the Oedipus complex symbolism all the way back in part 1 for nothing, you know. Definitely the most uncomfortable of the social links, especially if you return his feelings, oh god. Next we have the Moon social link, represented by Shinjiro Aragaki, which can be started in the evening after he rejoins SEES. This shows a more sensitive and vulnerable side to his character that is mostly absent from Makoto's route. While he seems very intimidating on the surface, he actually cares a lot about the other members of SEES, and takes on something of an older sibling role for them. He tries to make happy memories with everyone while he still can. Not for himself, but for the sake of others. He has, after all, already resigned himself to death, something that he becomes increasingly unsure of the longer he spends with Kotone. The story we see here is similar to the hero's own story and a lot of the other characters. Shinjiro finds an attachment to life through his bonds with other people. It makes a lot of sense then that, through bonds, Shinjiro is able to escape his inevitable fate. If Kotone finds his pocket watch and returns it to him before the Strength and Fortune boss, the story will take a different turn. The pocket watch will stop Takaya's bullet, saving his life, but he slips into a coma and is effectively gone for the rest of the game. He can be encountered one more time during New Game Plus.
Don't make a sick guy push himself so hard. It's pretty pathetic of me to forget the way I did. But even then, my feelings for you were the same as always. I got one thick skull, huh?
Shinjiro convinced himself that his death was how things should be. But this may have been another one of the moon's illusions leading him astray. The new Fortune social link is represented by Ryoji and begins automatically when he transfers into class. It's a bit strange in the sense that sometimes it levels up automatically and sometimes it has to be initiated by the player. Given Ryoji's flirtatious nature, it was inevitable that he would take an interest in Kotone. But just like the other guys, we get to see a more sensitive and genuine side of him. He goes through a bit of an existential crisis trying to figure out why she means so much to him. This one comes to a conclusion on the final day you speak to him. It doesn't change much, but it does add some new lines of dialogue to this scene. The Fortune Arcana tells of great change, and this is obviously a reference to how Ryoji is destined to become the appriser of death. That's it for new content concerning the returning characters. Let's take a look at the characters that never existed in the original game. Starting with the new face of the Chariot Arcana, Ryo Iwasaki. She's encountered as the leader of the volleyball or tennis clubs, depending on which one the player joins. In either case, she takes the club very seriously, much to the chagrin of its other members. She's a bit of a stick in the mud, and they make fun of her for not being in a relationship. But this is only because she secretly has a crush on her childhood friend, Kenji, who, as we all know, is more into older women. She's incredibly jealous that he's pursuing one of the teachers instead of her. She fears that it's because she has an unlikable personality. After admitting this to herself though, she's able to loosen up and relate a bit more with the other club members. Like Kazushi, Ryo's social link is about the importance of balance. In order to move forward, the Conqueror and the Chariot must gain control of the opposing sphinxes. She was so obsessed with sports that she ignored everything else and became detached from people. She isn't able to win Kenji's heart in the end, but she's happy just being someone he cares about. The new Hermit social link starts automatically when Kotone is forced to join a school committee. You can pick either the school health club or the library committee. In either case, you'll meet Sayori Hasegawa, a mature student a couple years older than everyone else. She's well respected because of this, or so it seems at first. Other students are constantly taking advantage of her kindness and she never stands up for herself. In other words, she is a doormat. So much so that she isn't even bothered about being called such by Kotone. She just happily smiles and accepts it. She freely admits that she has no agency of her own and just wants to be needed by someone. But this mentality gets her into serious trouble when she ends up in a magazine article filled with salacious lies. She had agreed to a journalist's request to take her picture as a favour to someone she hoped would become her friend. This completely destroys her reputation and gets her suspended from school for a while. But as long as you keep doing the social link, Kotone never leaves her side. She's the one and only person willing to stand up for her, and this inspires her to finally take her life into her own hands. Before being sent off to a private school, she hijacks the school's PA system to clear her name. She, quite literally, speaks up at last. The Hermit is about isolation and introspection. Sayori's true self was locked inside, and only when she was able to assert herself was she free from her long isolation. Social links aren't the only things exclusive to Kotone. She gets a bunch of new music as well, including a brand new battle track that's meant to better fit her personality. Portable may be missing most FMVs, but they did include a new opening that features both protagonists. I've always thought it was cool how you could flip the handheld upside down to see a version catered more to Kotone. The song here is called Soul Phrase, and its leitmotif is used throughout a few of the new tracks. So now we have the original Persona 3 soundtrack, the FES soundtrack, and now Portable's own soundtrack all in one game. It's quite a meaty soundtrack with a lot going on at this point. Strangely enough, the title screen music is Brand New Days from FES, even though Brand New Days was a song made for the answer which doesn't appear in Portable at all. Although, this place does look oddly familiar, and it even uses the Abyss of Time music. This is the Vision Quest Hall beyond the Paradigm Door, an optional challenge area in Tartarus. It shows up during the last month of the game. We'll discuss what you actually do here a little later, but for now the important part is that this place is managed by a woman named Margaret. She's the Velvet Room attendant from Persona 4. As I mentioned previously, there's a lot of Persona 4 influence in this particular version of the game, probably because it was released about a year after it. There's a few cameos like this to look out for. A younger Yukiko Amagi appears in an event exclusive to Kotone's route. They go on a trip to Inaba and you get to hear some of the music from that game. I guess we'll just throw in this one as well. One of the teachers appears during Operation Baypunt. It's not Persona 4, but there's also a cameo of Vincent Brooks from Catherine, a game that wasn't even out when Portable was released. If you want to get technical, it's not actually him, as indicated by the mole below his eye, but the predicament he describes is an obvious tease for that game. This Persona 4ification, for a lack of a better term, also extends to the gameplay as well. Persona 4's battle system didn't differ too much from 3's, but there was definitely a different design philosophy behind it, and Portable inherits more from this than it does the original Persona 3. The most significant change is the ability to control your party members. You can still have the AI take control of them if you want, but it's pretty obvious that the game doesn't really want you to do that anymore. Tactics are unlocked right from the get-go as opposed to being unlocked as the game progresses. But some of them are missing, such as knockdown, attack fallen, same target, assigned target, and standby. This is probably because you can just make them do this yourself now. Strangely, they added a new run-away command. You might think this functions the same as selecting escape, but it actually doesn't. Your party members will flee from battle on their own. I have no clue why they put this in here or why you would ever use it. The one more mechanics are still at work in Portable, but there's now a number of rule changes. Ignore much of what I said in part 3 of this analysis because it doesn't carry over to Portable. For example, enemies and allies now only need to hit one weakness to be granted a one more. This change was probably to encourage you to use more multi-targeting skills, but it also means that you're able to repeatedly hit the same enemies with the same multi-targeting skills as long as you knock down at least one of them. To balance things out a little, enemies now have an easier time getting one mores off of you. Knockdowns, on their own, no longer make an enemy or ally skip their turn. They'll get up and be able to take an action when their turn rolls around. They'll no longer recover if they take another hit while downed, but if their weakness is struck in this state, they'll be inflicted with the dizzy status. This will cause them to skip a turn. However, they'll recover for sure on the next turn, or if they're hit with an all-out attack. As long as they're still alive, that is. This change means that enemies and bosses can no longer be cheesed by keeping them down perpetually, which was a very effective strategy against the Crying Tables boss fight, and against the Reaper if you spammed him with Thunder Rain. The Wait command has been replaced by the Guard command. This effectively does the same thing, but gives you increased defense. It's very useful for when you can anticipate high damage attacks, like the Hermit's Gigaspark. The Mushroom Cloud after an all-out attack now looks like a skull if it was fatal. In all versions of the game, you could tell based on whether your party members got knocked back or not. As the C's social link ranks up, you'll be granted certain benefits in battle. During one Mors, a party member may request a co-op attack. This will knock down an enemy with a rather abrupt animation. Party members can save you from death by jumping in front of a fatal blow. Party members will also be able to survive a fatal blow once per battle. This is like how the Persona skill Endure functions. Homunculi now protect everyone in the party instead of just the hero. This sounds good, but it also means you can potentially lose 4 homunculi to 1 instant death spell. Very annoying if you're trying to save these things for Elizabeth. Sadly, there's some missing features as well. You may recall that in the original game, Makoto can use almost all the melee weapons, but in Portable he's now restricted to one-handed swords. Likewise, Kotone can only use her exclusive weapon class, the Naginata. Did they handicap Makoto so they wouldn't have to give Kotone animations for all the weapons? Maybe so. You can no longer see the entire turn order of a battle. You can only see 1 turn ahead. Seems like an incredibly arbitrary change to me. Another bizarre change is the complete overhaul of fusion spells. The spells themselves still do the same thing, but the way you go about using them has absolutely nothing to do with the personas in your inventory. They're now consumable items that can be used regardless of whether the player has, or has previously held, either of the 2 personas. It's a very odd choice, to say the least. You can trade gems for them at the antique store, which makes them a lot rarer to come by, especially with some of the pricier ones like Armageddon. This is quite annoying, since you need at least 1 of these and around 10 infinities to defeat Elizabeth. I suspect this scarcity is the reason why Elizabeth no longer has requests that involves you using them. Luckily, tediously farming for gems isn't the only way to get them. They're sometimes sold by Tanaka, and are rewards for completing vision quests. Another new item are skill cards. These can be used to give skills to a persona of your choice. They completely circumvent inheritance rules, so all bets are off. You can create all kinds of specialized personas that would have been incredibly difficult, if not outright impossible, in the original game. Like a Jack Frost with Aggie skills, for example. There's a few different avenues for obtaining these. Every persona in the game will give you one once you level it up enough. This can be abused by registering it in the compendium once it's close to a certain level, leveling it up to get the card, deleting it, pulling it back out of the compendium, and repeating the process. This same method can be used for farming heart items. You can also duplicate any skill card by handing it to a Nari Sushi at Naganaki Shrine. If you have the patience to sift through your no doubt stacked collection of cards, that is. This process takes 5 days, so it isn't usable on the last day of the game. Inari Sushi actually functioned a lot differently in the PS2 version. There was a whole slew of things possible, such as increasing your party members' stats, upping the drop rates in Tartarus, increasing the chances of a fusion accident. It was completely random, and you'd probably have to reload your save to get the desired result. You can also purchase skill cards from Tanaka, who sells a different lineup of items in Portable. Lastly, you can exchange gems for them at the antique store and get them from vision quests or for saving people from Tartarus. This is a new optional side quest that Elizabeth or Theo will call you about. but it isn't actually listed as one of their requests. Completing these involves exploring Tartarus for people who have gone missing in there. There's occasionally a few recognisable faces, such as Maiko and the old couple. If you rescue them before the deadline, Kurosawa at the police station will give you a reward. Speaking of which, this place is now open at night time and has a few changes of its own. In the original game, equipment that you purchased from here had a random effect. It upped your evasion or resistance against a certain element, something that would be very valuable if that element also happened to be someone's weakness. This is gone from Portable, probably because they didn't want you buying the same equipment over and over again trying to get the desired buff. You can also see your party's equipment much easier and equip them with stuff even if they're not there. Something interesting that the original Persona 3 did was to make your party members feel like they're their own people, as opposed to extensions of yourself. Portable throws this out the window though. You no longer have to talk to party members to heal or change their equipment. You can do it from the menu from anywhere in the game. The overworld in general has quite a few changes that are worth mentioning. You can now work part-time at the cafe in the movie theatre. B-Blue V at Polonia Mall no longer sells accessories. It can now be used to improve your condition, and accessories are sold by Kurosawa instead. A new save point has been added to the hero's desk. Previously, you could only save in the evenings. A bit of a small story change or clarification happens regarding Junpei's ultimate persona. Hermes merges with Medea to give rise to Trismegistus. As I mentioned back in part 3, exploring Tartarus became riskier the longer you went without a save point, but saving required you to abandon any progress you made up the tower between teleporters. Portable undermines this by allowing you to continue from the highest floor you reached. This does mean that you get more use out of the front entrance though. In the PS2 version, it just started you from the very first floor, so you would only ever get to use it once at the start of the game. The remaster undermines the difficulty even further by allowing you to continue from the start of the floor you died on. The Atlas purist in me shudders. Very convenient when fighting Elizabeth perhaps, but otherwise removes the last remnants of challenging dungeon crawling this game once had. This version allows you to switch the difficulties on the fly, by the way, including the 2 new difficulties added to Portable, and it even lets you make your own custom difficulty if you like. Plumes of Dusk have been removed from the easier difficulties in this version. Instead, you can revive infinitely on any difficulty if you choose to. The game just has cheat codes built in now.
Cheating, huh? I'm disappointed in you.
Exploring Tartarus in general is a very different affair to how it was in the original game. You no longer fully recover SP when you return to the bottom floor. You have to spend money at the clock to recover. Some days you may even get a discount on the clock. You give money to a clock to recover your magic. I know it's a weird abstract gameplay thing, but hearing Fuka talk about it made me realise how ridiculous it sounds. At any rate, this is a new method the game uses to get you to stop exploring Tartarus for the day, since your characters will no longer get tired after repeated battles, and will no longer leave Tartarus on their own. They'll still get tired, and Fuka will still make mention of it, but it won't take effect until the next day. They can, however, still get tired if you abandon them in Tartarus while they're unconscious. Characters no longer pocket the money they find, and as such, no longer change their equipment on their own. You can't spin the camera around at the top of Tartarus blocks anymore, possibly because of graphical limitations related to the PSP. A map has been added so you can get a full view of the floor you're on, instead of just relying on that tiny mini-map in the bottom corner. Characters' icons will now grey out to indicate that they're too far away to join you in battle. An exploit was fixed where you could repeatedly pause the game to force the shadows to change directions. If you want that back attack, well, now you just have to wait for it. A bunch of fun new costumes have been added, like the tuxedos for the guys and the fan-servicey outfits for Kotone. These, in addition to the new romance options, can lead to a lot of interesting interactions in Tartarus. How you pick cards in shuffle time is now a bit different. Instead of moving off screen, they spin around like this. making it a bit easier to get the cards you want. Here's a change that was only introduced in the 2023 remaster. Low-level shadows don't make that screeching sound anymore when you scare them away. I honestly kind of miss that. This was no doubt an intentional change, probably because they thought it was annoying, but I don't think the same can be said for the faster movement speed of the shadows in the remaster. Shadows that you could easily run past in the original now catch up with you with ease, making them much more dangerous. This is very noticeable when you compare them side by side like this. Portable uses the same Persona roster as FES for the most part, with a few additions. Tamlin, Mokoi, Neko Shogun, and Satanta. This brings the roster from 169 to 173. Technically it's 174 if you want to count the other version of Orpheus that Kotone starts with. It has a slightly different design with long brown hair that resembles Kotone a bit. The game actually considers them two separate personas, as they both can be registered in the compendium and be used by either protagonist during New Game Plus. Only one of them is required for 100% of the compendium though. Finally, let's take a look at the new battles and super bosses that have been added. The Vision Quest challenges can be split into two different types. The first kind has you refighting the full moon shadows with higher stats. The second kind are a bit more interesting though. Each one is based around a theme related to stats. We have power, magic, resistance, speed, and luck. They're puzzles essentially. Your items, personas, and party members are fixed, so you have to play by the game's rules. It's also pretty clear that they expect you to be using direct commands for these. Once you beat all of these, you can then challenge this version's new super boss, Margaret. This fight is a lot easier than Elizabeth since you can use a full party, and you're allowed to nullify her attacks without getting insta-killed. You must, however, deal 5,000 damage every 10 turns. There are 5 phases to this fight where she has different attacks and resistances. Like Elizabeth, she cycles through her own inventory of personas, and knowledge of which one she's using is essential to winning. She has a total of 30,000 HP, and once she drops below 10,000, you can safely use Armageddon to finish her off. This isn't mandatory though, and she can be beaten just fine without it. Having Theodore as your Velvet Room attendant gets you an alternate version of this fight. Funnily enough, in the PSP version, Fuka's dialogue is unchanged, so she appears to mistake Theo for a woman.
Is it just me, or does it seem like she wants to fight? What? Her power is unbelievable! Who is she?
This was fixed in the 2023 version, but only the text. The voice acting associated with it just gets muted. Anyway, Theo's version of this fight isn't much different. He uses different personas than Elizabeth, but this is merely cosmetic. His attacks and resistances are the same. In case you're curious, here's a new lineup. When it comes to this fight, your choice of accessory is very important, and there's only really 2 choices. Barbaric Bracers or Divine Pillar. Barbaric Bracers will double your evasion against all attacks, while the Divine Pillar will make you unable to evade but will half all damage. You can't expect to win through high counter alone, so you must have at least a couple elemental spells to do damage. When Theo uses fire, use ice. When he uses ice, use fire. Only the opposite element of what he's using will be effective. It's recommended to have the highest tier elemental spells you can get on Orpheus Telos. Ragnarok, Niflheim, Thunder Rain, and Panta Ray. Realistically though, you're only going to be able to get a couple of these at most, but this should be enough to win the fight. The only one that can be found as a skill card is Mara's Maralagadine. The rest must be inherited. So that's Persona 3 Portable. Is it the definitive edition of Persona 3? Not really, and I don't think it was ever intended to be. It was meant to be a portable version of the game with some fun bits of fan service to keep things interesting. Persona 3 was never designed with full party controls in mind, and you can definitely tell by playing this. It's a lot easier, too easy in fact. The definitive experience is the PS2 version with its higher quality presentation. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as that anymore. If you're on console, portable is your only option, ironically enough. My recommendation would be to fire up PCSX2 and experience this game how it was originally intended. That's it though. Now I've taken a look at every version of Persona 3. There's nothing left to talk about. Nothing at all. Why do I feel like I'm forgetting something? A special thank you to my channel members and patrons. And you, the viewer, for sitting through this really long recut of the Persona 3 analysis videos. I've been Snickety Slice, I'll see you with Persona 3 Reload, I guess.